The air in the vault is colder than the dawn outside, a slow breath drawn through stone that has listened for centuries. The lantern in your hand sways, its light spilling over two emblems inlaid on the table before you. One bearing the red cross of an order the world believes dead, the other an unfinished eye that watches without blinking. Above, somewhere in the cloister, boots scrape and voices rise. But here, in this room, no map admits exists. The past waits with the patience of granite. You are one of the few who walked away when the arrests began, carrying more than coin or relics. You carry the spine of a network that could outlive kings, shape empires, and one day, centuries from now, bear a name whispered in half-light, the Illuminati. If you have ever felt the pull of history's quieter corridors, where the dust hides more than it reveals, and truth moves underfoot like water, then stay close. We will follow the vow through cathedrals and courts, across oceans and under mountains, until its shadow touches the edges of your own night. And before the vault, before the coin found its lock, before the eye and cross were ever carved side by side, there was a morning in Paris when the air itself seemed to pause. The dawn of October 13th, 1307, opened soft and blue over Paris. It was the kind of morning that seemed to promise only routine. The murmur of market stalls setting up, the whinny of horses from the royal stables, the faint tang of baking bread in the alleys. But in the chapel of the temple, where the Red Cross banner hung motionless in the cold, another scent lingered, a mingling of wax, wool, and steel. The scribes kept their ink pots close to small braziers, careful that the chill did not thicken the flow, and the flicker of coals lit their faces in shifting amber. Our narrator, though they did not think of themselves that way, was at the long table, bent over an accounts ledger. The parchment was already rippling at the edges from the damp in the air, but the columns of figures ran steady, neat as marching feet. Each numeral was a footprint in a network of credit that reached from Paris to Acre, from London to Cyprus, lines of trust written in careful hand. The work was soothing. The world outside could be kept beyond the walls for a while. Yet something was different. A quiet tension, too subtle to name, hummed in the cold stones. The brothers spoke in low tones, their words halved by glances toward the door. Somewhere below, in the kitchens, the sound of ladles and knives was too sharp, too hurried, and every so often the wind carried up from the street a muffled clink, as though 100 pieces of armor were shifting in place. Paris at that hour was a city between breaths. The night watch had gone, the day's bustle not yet risen, and in that stillness the king's men gathered. They moved like shadows through the fog pooling along the Seine, their torches banked, boots muffled with cloth. The orders had been signed in secrecy, the plan whispered among captains for weeks. In every command, the same name was repeated: Knights of the Temple. Above them, the sky paled. From a certain angle, the first light silvered the temple's spire until it seemed a blade pointed heavenward. Inside, the brothers finished their prayers. The brazier hissed as another log was set, and the scent of smoke coiled lazily toward the rafters. It would later be debated how much warning the Templars had. Some say they knew for days, smuggling out treasures and records in the dead of night, sending messengers south. Others believe the arrest was a thunderclap, striking without signal. But in this moment, in this particular chapel, our scribe lifted his head from the ledger, feeling that peculiar pressure in the air. the way one feels a storm long before the sky darkens. He dipped the quill, let a drop of red wax fall onto the corner of the latest entry. The seal's ring pressed into it left a clean circle, a cross faintly visible in its center. It was the mark of authenticity, the quiet assurance that what was written here was true. He watched the wax cool, unaware that it would be the last he pressed for many years. Beyond the gate, boots found stone. The king's men spread out, each group taking a door, a window, a postern. Their commander carried the warrant like a dagger in his sleeve. The bells of Paris had not yet rung the hour when the first ram struck wood. Inside, the blow sounded like the world cracking. The brothers startled, hands going to sword hilts, but the orders from their Grand Master came sharp: hold, wait, do nothing to provoke. Still the scribe's heart began to race, not with fear alone, but with the sudden, unshakable knowledge that the work on his desk, the numbers and names, could not be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. He thought of the routes marked in his mind: safe houses, merchant contacts, the hidden ledgers and stone niches. The red wax seal in front of him seemed to glow in the brazier's light, as if urging him to move. Outside, the rams struck again. Stone dust fell from the lintel. Voices barked commands, and then the door gave. The first soldiers spilled into the hall, armor dim in the candlelight, breath clouding the cold air. The Grand Master stepped forward, his face a mask of composure, speaking words meant to slow the tide. But already others were moving toward the records room, toward the heart of the temple's quiet power. Our scribe slid the ledger into a satchel, the wax still soft enough to smear. The satchel was heavier than he expected, as though the weight of its numbers was more than parchment could bear. He turned toward the narrow door that led to the undercroft, boots striking the worn steps with quick, soft thuds. In the undercroft, the air grew damp, the scent of limestone and old water replacing the smoke. This was the beginning of the network beneath Paris, the veins of stone carved for quarrying, now serving other purposes. He paused at the threshold, hearing the muffled clash above, and for a heartbeat thought of returning. But the vow, whispered only hours before in the shadows, pressed against his ribs: safeguard the work, safeguard the brothers, whatever it takes. Somewhere far above, a bell finally began to toll. The sound rolled down into the earth like a warning from another world. He shifted the satchel higher on his shoulder and stepped into the dark, the brazier's glow now just a memory on the backs of his eyes. Behind him, the soldiers would seize much: men, arms, property, but not the ledger, not the seal, not the vow newly sworn in the half-light of a Paris morning. And in that quiet stone passage, where the walls wept and the air was close, the first step was taken toward something that would not have a name for centuries yet, a lineage of secrecy that would flow like an underground river, unseen but persistent, toward another city, another time. The candle in the chapel guttered, sending up one last thin curl of smoke before dying in the chill. The undercroft swallowed sound and stretched the minutes thin. He moved by finger memory, tracing the shallow grooves cut into the wall to guide a palm in the dark. The ledger rode against his ribs, a steady weight like a small, warm animal. Above, the bell kept tolling, and dust sifted down like gray snow. He had sworn the new vow in that same darkness before the knocking, near the lamp niche where soot had glazed the stone. It was not the bright Latin of the rule, but a smaller braid meant to survive, keep the brothers, Keep the work, keep the balance when power tilts. If parchment burned, let numbers live in blood and memory. If doors fell, make the city itself a book with hidden pages. He could still smell the resin in the wax he had warmed. The brothers favored that blend. It left a faint sweetness on parchment, a private reassurance when the day's affairs were hard. A key lay beneath the niche, iron worn smooth by generations. The teeth did not fit a door so much as a principle. Open only what can be closed again. The lock yielded, and a shorter corridor took him into air so close his breath felt like smoke. He could not finish exhaling. The stone sweated cold onto his knuckles. History would later call the Templars bankers in chainmail, the first to make credit travel safely in a rough world. A pilgrim could leave coin in Paris, carry a coded letter, and draw value in Acre or London. He had watched such letters move like trained birds, ciphers plain if you had the key and meaningless otherwise. Trust was the real currency. The order kept it moving like blood. Whether they knew what dawn was coming would be argued long after the stones cooled. Some insist there were whispers, merchants passing a weather report from court to counting house, the pressure falling fast. Others say men of rule and routine never hear rumors even when they rap the shutters like rain. All he knew was the feeling along the spine that says quickly, now, before the sky decides. He pressed his thumb to a shallow circle cut into the jamb and felt the old nerve trick warm his skin. Beyond lay a chamber no bigger than a stall, 3 slots chiseled at shoulder height. Up close you could see faint wax halos smeared around each opening, ghost seals that had kissed stone instead of parchment. On the opposite wall, a slate hung by a leather thong, scratched with a nursery rhyme meter. If you knew which word to stress, the path through the undercroft unrolled in your head like a ribbon. He mouthed the lines and took the door opposite instinct. A cheer far above broke like surf through a cave mouth. He thought of salt then, the ocean's preserving sting, fishwives rubbing brine into meat to cheat the rot. Ash and salt, loss and keeping. He touched the ledger again, as if to feel a pulse. The bell rolled its warning down through the bones of the earth. A niche opened to his left. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. He found a narrow cord, knotted at measured intervals. Each knot a number, each number a place, each place a direction. A cord could survive where paper could not. He looped it under his tunic and felt the last knot settle against his sternum like a quiet command. He had been a child when he first saw the double column that measured a life without counting coins, debits and credits, like inhale and exhale, a lung of numbers. Perhaps that was why the vow came so easily. Life and ledger were not different things, only different ways of keeping something true over time. Keep the balance, keep the brother, keep the word. A slit window near the ceiling gave river light, pale and uncertain. In that wash he noticed a scrap tucked under a chipped stone, a margin doodle of an owl, no larger than a fingernail, 2 strokes for eyes, a third for beak. Someone had sketched it while waiting for courage. Under the stone lay a shallow vault with 2 packets, small silver and a fine dusting of sand. The silver would buy time. The sand would dry ink without smear. He pressed the stone back, thinking of ships and ballast, how a few shovels steadied a hull when wind turned tricky. At the next door the key hesitated, then turned. The smell changed at once, less earth, more world. A draught carried sour wine, baking bread, the cold iron of dawn. feet crossed the courtyard above in a measured pace, like a captain counting to avoid shouting. His hand found the seal ring in the satchel's front pocket. He turned it until he felt the tiny nick on its rim, a flaw he trusted. Perfect marks invite suspicion. This one was human. He pressed the ring into his palm until the circle tingled in the skin. The vow lived there now, warm, despite the chill. It had no flourish, only shape and rule. Preserve the chain of trust with whatever tools the day allows. If the chain passed through hands no oath had ever touched, let character be the binder. A merchant's word, a widow's chest, a mason's coffer, the city as a book of secret pages. A door yielded in a different corridor. He pictured splinters lifting like reeds along a riverbank. He pictured ash drifting after the search, lifted by boots and falling again in thin, defeated weather. The body did not picture. The body had work. He angled upward on a service passage where chisel scars caught his soles. The air tasted cleaner. He listened. One guard near a postern, another pacing, a third farther off counting the bell strokes inside his head. There was a lull between the tolls when men make quick decisions. In that lull, he began to move. The ledger lay flat against him. The cord's knots, a line of stars he could read by touch. He thought of La Rochelle and stories that had grown like barnacles on hulls. Some true, some only beautifully shaped. He thought of letters of exchange, traveling in fish carts and reliquary cases, invisible roads within roads. When the bell paused, he counted to the number that meant now. His hand found the latch. The postern sighed like a sleeper turning over. Cold air filled his lungs as if it had been waiting for him since the city was first laid out. The postern closed behind him with the smallest click, a sound too soft to mark an ending. Beyond it lay the city's underbreath, tunnels cut first for stone, then adopted by whatever work could not bear the daylight. Here the air held the damp patience of centuries, touched with the mineral tang of the Seine, seeping through hidden veins. He kept one hand on the wall, where chisel marks still spoke of the men who'd swung their tools for the cathedral above. Their rhythm was frozen in the rock, a sequence of angled blows, a pause, another set. Sometimes he imagined he could match a name to the pattern, a mason long gone but present in the curve of the groove. The path underfoot sloped gently, leading away from the familiar and towards something more dangerous. The ledger shifted in its satchel with a whisper of parchment against parchment. He had carried heavier burdens in war, steel, shield, the weight of a friend's life, but never something so absolutely helpless against flame. It was only hide and ink, yet it held the shape of promises, binding the order's farthest limbs together. A ledger was not treasure, but it could command treasure, move armies without the clatter of hooves. In the wrong hands, it could betray more than any captive's tongue. The tunnels forked without pattern. Some led into abrupt walls, as if the work had been abandoned mid-swing. Others sank deeper, filled with the hush of underground water. He chose by memory, recalling the verses scratched on the slate in the hidden chamber. Each rhyme a junction, each rhyme a survival. At the first bend, his lantern showed a half-collapsed arch where saltpeter crystals had furred the stone like frost. Beyond it, a smaller passage opened, walls close enough to brush his shoulders. It was here the air thickened with the musk of old oil and dust, a sign that others had passed not long ago. Whether friend or foe, The stone did not say. He thought of ash, how quickly it erases, and how stubbornly it clings. He had seen whole storehouses reduced to soft gray in a night, only to find a charred coin lying perfect amid the ruin. The order's enemies might scatter their bodies, burn their halls, grind their seal into powder, but if the vow survived in even one mind, it could kindle again. Ash to ember, ember to flame. A faint sound ahead made him halt. Not footsteps, more a shuffle. A stone nudged and left to settle. He crouched, setting down the satchel, letting the darkness close around him like a second cloak. The damp stone chilled his fingers, but the cold steadied him. The sound came again, closer now, followed by a glimmer of light. 2 points flickering, then masked as the bearer turned a corner. The scent of pitch confirmed it. A torch, perhaps in an untrained hand. He let them pass. 2 men, speaking in low, uncertain tones. Their words carried strangely by the tunnel. They were not king's soldiers. Their gait lacked the uniform stamp. Merchants, perhaps, or messengers, using the veins of stone for quiet travel. One carried a bundle whose weight shifted like coin. When their glow had gone, he rose and continued, steps muffled on the packed earth. The passage widened, and he entered a chamber where the ceiling arched higher, supported by thick ribs of untouched limestone. Here, shelves of stone jutted from the walls, each holding bundles wrapped in waxed cloth. This was one of the caches, a place known only to the first circle and guarded more by obscurity than force. He set the ledger on the central slab, running his hand over its cover. Beside it lay a small box of oak, its lid bound by leather straps. Inside were tools, a compass, a square, a seal stamp without a crest. The compass legs were blunted from travel, the square marked with faint notches for ciphering letters into angles. He traced them with a thumb, knowing these tools would speak differently in other times, perhaps as builders' instruments, perhaps as moral emblems. From the box, he took a length of twine, knotting it around the ledger's satchel. The knots fell in a particular sequence, the same taught to him years ago, a hidden ledger within the ledger, a story of numbers without ink. If the satchel were lost, a hand versed in the code could still rebuild the truth from memory. Quieter now, he placed the satchel beneath the central slab, in the hollow shaped to hold it. Over this, he set a plain cloth, then a thin layer of gravel to disguise the outline. Above, a tile carved with a rose and acacia sprig sealed the hiding place. The rose, symbol of silence, beauty kept in shadow. The acacia, memory that survives burial. Together they meant that what was placed here should sleep until called. He stood in the lantern's dim halo, listening to the far-off murmur of the river through unseen cracks. The water's voice was old, indifferent to kings, to orders of monks, to the names scratched on their seals. It moved always forward, returning again, tide to tide, idea to idea. Somewhere above, boots would be trampling the temple's upper rooms. Swords would flash, and parchment would burn. Down here, in the cool heart of Paris, the ledger would outlast the day. Perhaps it would outlast him. The vow tightened in his chest like a second heartbeat. Keep the brothers. Keep the work. Keep the balance. It was a simple triad, easier to carry than steel. He had sworn it in shadows, and now the shadows kept their end. He took the lantern and retraced his steps toward another exit, this one sloping toward the outer streets. The tunnels narrowed again, forcing him to turn sideways at one point. The walls were damp, beads of water catching the light like stars in miniature. He touched them as he passed, a ritual for luck learned from a mason long ago. When at last he found the faint daylight of a drainage grate, he knelt and looked through. A quiet lane, no soldiers, only a cat slinking along the wall. He slid the grate aside, the stones scraping softly. Cool air rolled in, tasting of bread and river. Emerging into that lane felt like stepping from dream to waking, yet he knew the dream had only changed shape. The ledger was no longer on his shoulder, but it was still his burden, alive in the hidden cache. The veins of stone had taken it in, added it to their slow, patient memory. He straightened, drew his hood close, and walked toward the market crowds already beginning their day. Behind him, beneath layers of stone and silence, the vow slept, ready to be woken by another hand in another age. The market's hum folded behind him like a book shut without a sound, and in its place rose a different music, rigging tapping masts, gulls crying like squeaking hinges, the slow breath of tide against pilings. La Rochelle came into view with its twin towers bracing the harbor mouth as if holding open a door for history. Salt lived in everything here, the planks, the ropes, the men's sleeves, even the parchment tags that curled on crates like drying leaves. He tasted it on his lips and thought of preservation, how salt can keep a thing from rotting long enough to cross an ocean or outlast a rain. Beneath his ribs, the vow kept its slow, reliable measure, the way a harbor clock keeps time for ships it will never see again. They would later call La Rochelle a rumor factory, but in this hour it was only a port doing what ports do, swallowing arrivals, exhaling departures, counting coin with a casual intimacy. The Templars had long used these keys, sending pilgrim funds west to become east again, letting letters of credit travel farther than any knight could ride in a week. That, at least, is the firm ground of fact. The order kept agents here, and the harbor registers once bore their names before those pages were pulled like weeds from a book. Between two barrels, someone had chalked a small circle on the planks, then smudged a cross within it. A private dockhand shorthand for cargo already paid, or perhaps only an idle hand remembering a symbol now risky to own. He stepped around it as if it still held heat. The water here carried the city's breath back to it, a faint blend of tar and yeast and fish that reminded him of soup on winter evenings. Shipwrights spoke their own liturgy of caulking and pitch, their beehive hum absorbed into the wide wooden throats of the hulls. A long-armed crane swung a bundle of spars like a shepherd moving quiet sheep, and somewhere a cat threaded itself under coils of line, tail chalked with dust. The sun struck the sea into coins, and then into shredded silver, a currency no ledger could keep. He watched it flare and flatten, thinking how easily wealth becomes brightness, and then nothing at all. Stories find harbors the way driftwood does, pushed, returned, reshaped. On these stones the story would grow that the Templars' fleet vanished at La Rochelle, slipping away before the nets closed, full of treasure and reckoning. The truth is a mesh, too. Records fragment, captains die, storms scatter a memory into smaller weather. Some say the ships went north with the last of the order's coffers. Others swear they hugged the coast, hiding in coves, selling rigs piece by piece, until a noble's hunting lodge rose from their ribs. The debated heart is simple and impossible. Did a true escape unfold here, or only a soft theft by time and paperwork? He moved along the quay, reading the ordinary as if it were cipher. Chalk marks on crate ends, registered owners in a language of curves and cuts. A spar carried a maker's notch, two shallow chevrons that would let a builder claim his work years later with a touch and a nod. The harbor ledger, the public one, glossed over these small truths with neat lines and respectable names. He had learned to feel the space between lines as a kind of map, where the ink thinned, where the clerk's hand hesitated, where sand dusted a page more heavily to dry something written quickly. In that space, conspiracies sprout or wither. Here, on this wind, he felt both possibilities in balance. A boy ran past with a bundle of sailcloth, the bolt leaving a crisp wake of linen smell. He vanished into a warehouse whose door wore a lock plate darkened by hands, and for a moment the thought of keys warmed the scribe's palm again, though his hand was empty. Keys were promises with teeth. They kept secrets in place, but also made secrets mobile. He pictured the Undercroft in Paris with its shallow halos of wax rubbed into stone, and then imagined a twin halo pressed on a ship's mast, a vow traveling by tide rather than tunnel. Salt for ash, water for stone, different media for the same stubborn intention. Not everything present was symbol. A pilot boat slid past, its helmsman reading the chop with a squint that had been paid for by years. He marked the speed of the swell between bastions, how the current pinched as a throat pinches before a hard word. Farther out, a square rigger stretched like a waking animal as the wind found more of its cloth. Ropes creaked, and the sound felt intimate, the way a house settles at night when you finally found sleep. A gull dropped to the foam, then rose, then drifted toward a fish-scent promise elsewhere. He followed it with his eyes until the bird became a character in the margin of the morning. He paused by a small altar tucked into the harbor wall, a niche holding a weather-soft statue of a saint whose face had been washed away by salt and prayer. Someone had left a sprig of something evergreen, a poor man's acacia perhaps, or only a branch that looked like remembrance when the light was right. The wax puddle before the statue had captured last night's wind in ripples. Its red yielded to brown at the edges, a ring where certainty had been and was not. He felt in that cooled shape the outline of their work, a seal that would darken and blur as it moved through time, still a circle even after the cross inside had been rubbed nearly clean. If the fleet truly slipped its bonds, it must have done so in a rhythm like this one, not with trumpets, but with tides. A tide asks nothing extravagant. It brings small gifts patiently, a half fathom more room to move, a shadow longer than a guard's attention. Men who live by water learn to count in breaths between waves, to change a plan at the skip of a rope on the bollard. He thought of a plan spoken only in half lines under tavern rafters, a schedule disguised as a psalm, a departure agreed upon with a lifted mug, and 3 heartbeats of silence. And he thought of bad weather conjured by rumor, how quickly a story can raise whitecaps where there is only a mild swell. A clerk stood at the end of the pier pouring fine sand over a ledger leaf to drink the shine from the fresh ink. The page lifted a little as if to inhale, then settled again under the brush of his hand. The scribe could almost read the columns from where he stood. Name, cargo, weight, dues. But the clerk's eyes flicked once to the towers at the harbor mouth, as if measuring not the ships below, but the spaces between stone teeth. He knew that look. It was the look of any man who must reconcile the clean demands of a page with the messier, older tides of power. He moved on, keeping to the lee of a warehouse where tar sweetened the shade. A murmur pressed outward from inside, men arguing mildly, the way men argue prices when each already knows the answer. He felt the vow answer in its quiet way, not by flaring, but by settling deeper, like ballast shifting to stabilize a turn. Once, he would have reached for a sword because that was what a soldier reached for. Today he reached for memory, for the soft ink map that could not be seized in a raid, contacts, favors, debts disguised as gifts. A wind-pushed veil of spray dusted the key and left tiny salt crystals on his lashes. When he blinked, the world briefly pixelated, then cleared into sharper lines. He took that as a blessing. Sleep sometimes gives the same mercy. A blur, then clarity, then the gentle permission to rest. The harbor bells answered the city's inland chimes, with a note less holy and more practical. Somewhere, in an upstairs window above a chandlery, he saw a small wooden owl perched among coils of rope. It was a child's toy, perhaps, or a shopman's whim, but the sight made a cool line down his spine. Eyes in places where paper cannot watch. Ships came and ships went, and if any had once carried away a treasure-laden order into mist, the mist had done its patient work since then, becoming story. He could not seize the truth with hands, but he could move with the current the truth left behind. That current flowed, not on water, but along a web of trust that dock ledgers could not fully record, a pattern of obligations threaded through families, guilds, and houses of prayer and profit. He felt the tug of it now, almost physical, drawing him away from the glamour of hulls toward the quieter inland streets, where numbers change shape and keep moving. There, beyond the smell of tar and the gulls' bright heckling, the city flattened into alleys whose windows were eyes that pretended not to see. He turned from the quay, letting the water's music fade to memory, and stepped into the book of streets, where ink does not always appear and where the pages can be turned by hand without any clerk's bell. The chalk mark on the planks behind him would be scuffed away by noon, but the route it hinted at would remain, spoken softly and carried in mind like a prayer with no written words, ready to be followed wherever coin and conscience must go. The gull's calls thinned as he stepped inland, replaced by the closer, warmer sounds of commerce conducted face to face. Stalls leaned into one another like conspirators, canvas awnings trembling in the morning wind, each one shading a different kind of promise: grain, salted meat, wool, tin. The street bent with the shoreline but hid the sea from view. Here, trade traveled on the breath of voices and the glint of weighed coin. In these lanes, maps were not parchment rolled into tubes, but memories passed like heirlooms. A boy carried his father's route in his head the way others carried prayers, reciting place names in an order that meant nothing to outsiders. 2 streets over, an old woman in a linen cap murmured to a cooper about the 5th market after the Silver Arch, and he nodded as if she had said Tuesday. This was the geography of trust, not of borders, a mesh of favors and obligations stretching across kingdoms. The Templar method had always favored such networks. A line inked on a chart could be stolen, but a line that ran through a human mind could not. Merchants aligned themselves like constellations, a shipwright here, a miller there, each connected by quiet understanding rather than any visible chain. If one link faltered, the others shifted to take the strain, the way a spider's web shivers and resettles when touched. He walked as if reading a book whose words lived in gestures, the short lift of a chin between two men hauling sacks, the deliberate pause of a fishmonger before giving a price, the half-smile of a carter who had been paid in something other than coin. These were the lines of the map without ink, a chart that only revealed itself to those already drawn upon it. A baker's boy passed carrying a tray of loaves, steam still curling from their seams. The smell, warm yeast overlaid with the faint bitterness of the wood smoke that baked it, slipped under his guard and reminded him of the temple kitchens, of mornings that had begun without fear. Memory, like trade, moved along its own hidden routes. He paused at a fountain where the stone basin had worn smooth from centuries of cups and hands. A mason's mark hid on its underside, two intersecting lines that might mean nothing, or might mark the work as blessed by a particular lodge. The water tasted faintly of iron, grounding him in the present. Around the fountain, traders exchanged news in snatches, a failed harvest to the south, a noble's sudden illness in the north. Information moved like coin, handed over, received, and often altered in the passing. It was here he spotted a familiar gesture, a woman adjusting the hem of her apron 3 times in quick succession. She looked past him, toward a man who stood too still for a marketplace. That was the sign. The still man would be the carrier today. In the fold of her apron she held a small packet no bigger than a folded letter, wrapped in oiled cloth against the weather. It would pass hands before the hour turned, crossing streets and changing pockets until it reached a counting table in another city entirely. The value inside could be coin, or it could be a message rendered into numbers, entries and exits of goods, debts disguised as trades. He did not need to know. The point was that it would move without leaving any mark in an official ledger. The map would shift to accommodate it, and no border guard or king's man could follow. Such arrangements could survive the fall of an order or the outlawing of a name. They survived because they were as flexible as tide water, as quick to fill a gap as water is to find a crack in stone. In Paris, they had called these networks veins of gold. Here, they were simply the way things worked, though none would name them aloud in the wrong company. He turned into a narrow lane where sunlight barely touched the cobbles. Laundry lines stretched overhead like slack rigging, and under them an elderly scribe sat with a low table and a goose quill, writing nothing anyone could read without the right key. Her ledger appeared ordinary, columns of amounts and goods, but the spacing of her entries told a second story, one meant for eyes trained to see it. She looked up, met his gaze briefly, and then went back to her work, the quill whispering across the page. Every mark she made was a star in the constellation of the map without ink. To anyone else, the paper would seem mundane. To those within the vow's reach, it would point to warehouses, safe houses, ships that might or might not leave on schedule. This was how a fleet could vanish without magic, slip into the negative space of official record, exist only in the shared memory of 100 careful people. He remembered the knotted cord under his tunic, the way each knot told a story in numbers. If it were stretched out beside the old woman's ledger, the two would match like twin halves of a seal. That thought steadied him. If the worst happened and the web tore, it could be rewoven from those two sources alone, one carried by flesh, the other disguised in ink. A bell rang somewhere inland, its sound warped by the close walls. The traders shifted their pace, some speeding, others lingering as if to avoid coincidence. He knew the signal's meaning here, a message inbound, perhaps in the hands of a rider now crossing the outer fields. Soon the market's rhythm would change entirely. New lines would be drawn on the invisible chart and others erased. As he left the lane, a boy darted past with a string of fish, scales catching the light in quick, silver blinks. In another moment, they were gone into the crowd, the way information and coin disappeared into the map. Never truly lost, only somewhere you were not looking. The sea was still close enough for him to smell on the air, a reminder that this network did not end at the edge of the land. Its lines ran under the waves, as surely as under the cobbles, joining port to port the way veins join hand to heart. Somewhere out there, perhaps beyond even the reach of rumor, were ships whose names had been scratched off the registers but still carried the vow in their holds. He let the thought settle in him like a weight he could carry. A map without ink could not be stolen, only learned, and that learning was its own form of possession. He had walked enough of its lines to know that even if the parchment burned, the roots would remain in the minds of those who kept them, moving, shifting, surviving. And as the market swallowed him again, its sounds rising like surf in a narrow bay, he felt the map itself move with him, every face and gesture another point of light in the dark, every step another invisible line drawn toward the work still ahead. Snow still clung to the higher ridges when he left the coast behind, trading salt air for the thin, mineral taste of the mountains. The road to the pass was a patient climb, stitched with switchbacks and marked by cairns that looked like the knuckles of giants. Traders moved in small knots here, mule trains with bells, solitary riders with cloaks drawn close. Each step up seemed to strip away the noise of the world below until only the crunch of his boots and the occasional wingbeat of a crow broke the silence. He had been told of an Alpine horde long before the arrests in Paris, a rumor folded into conversation like a harmless jest. Somewhere above the tree line, beneath a chapel ruin no wider than a shepherd's hut, lay a purse of coins sealed in oiled leather, hidden generations ago and forgotten by most. Its existence was never recorded in any ledger. Its value was not in gold alone, but in the mark on one of its pieces, a mark that might tie the work of the vow to times yet to come. The chapel appeared suddenly, crouched against the wind, like an old man guarding a secret. Its roof had fallen in long ago, and the altar was only a suggestion in the snow. Stone walls pressed in close, their mortar veined with ice. Inside, the air held a stillness particular to places where prayers had once been spoken. He moved to the southeast corner, where a single slab lay out of place, tilted as if the earth had shifted under it. Kneeling, he brushed away the snow and traced the chisel scars along its edge. They were not mason's marks. They were a code of angles, each pointing to the next step. He levered the slab aside with the haft of his dagger. Beneath, a hollow no deeper than his forearm exhaled a faint scent of leather and earth. He reached in and found the purse. The leather was stiff but not brittle, the stitches still holding after so many winters. He set it on the slab and worked the knot loose. Inside, coins shifted with the dry whisper of stone on stone. Most were ordinary enough, local mintings with the faces of long-dead dukes, but one caught the light differently. He held it up to the thin sun, and felt the cold of it bite his fingertips. It was larger than the others, a thick silver disc whose face bore the familiar cross of the temple. But where the reverse should have been blank or crowned, there was instead a strange geometry, an incomplete triangle, and above it, a small eye rendered with surprising delicacy. Not the open, radiating eye of providence seen in later civic buildings, but a watching presence nonetheless. Around it, the faint impression of a laurel that had worn almost smooth. The workmanship was finer than any coin he had seen struck for common use, and the symbols together were impossible. The cross and the eye belonged to different centuries, different tongues of craft, yet here they were, married in silver, sealed away, where only a code keeper of the vow might find them. He turned it over and over, the weight steady, the cold slow to yield to his hand's warmth. Stories have a way of recruiting objects into their service, and he knew this coin would serve many, proof for some, heresy for others. To those outside the circle, it could be dismissed as a forger's whim, a pilgrim's token fancied up for sale at a fair. But within the vow, it would be read as continuity, a sign that the work was not a chain of isolated acts, but a single weave stretched across time. He slipped it into a small pouch at his belt, separate from the other coins. The rest he returned to the purse, tightening the knot and settling it back into its hollow. The slab went over it, the snow smoothed by his gloved hand. Some secrets were meant to sleep longer. The coin he kept was awake enough. On the descent the wind rose, filling the pass with a low, continuous hum. He thought of the beehive's song in the masons' workshops, of the quiet murmur in a counting house when figures aligned. The mountain seemed to speak in that same register, a language of persistence, of work carried on without proclamation. By the time he reached the lower slopes, the road had thawed into rivulets that traced their way down to join larger streams. He imagined the water carrying fragments of the mountain into the valleys, into the rivers, into the sea, just as a single object, a single idea, could travel far from its origin and still carry the taste of its first place. At a wayside inn, he took a corner seat where the fire's heat reached without glare. He laid the coin on the table and studied it again, the eye catching a glint from the flames. A merchant at the next table glanced over and looked away quickly, as though recognizing something best left unspoken. The innkeeper brought bread and a wedge of cheese, her gaze flicking to the coin and back to his face, with no expression at all. She knew better than to ask. Later, in his small chamber under the eaves, he pressed the coin into a scrap of wax and watched the impression form. The cross stood clean. The eye hovered above as if looking out from another world. In the wax, the lines seemed even older, as though they had been waiting for this softer medium to reveal themselves. He broke the wax and scattered it in the hearth, letting the pieces curl and blacken in the coals. The coin went back into its pouch, which went under his pillow. Sleep came slowly, carrying with it dreams of corridors that stretched from stone vaults to shipholds to candlelit lodges, all linked by the same unseen geometry. In those dreams, the coin rolled along the path ahead of him, its two faces catching alternate flashes of light, never stopping, never choosing which side it preferred. When dawn came, he was already awake, the coin cool again in his hand. Outside, the mountains faded into cloud, their ridges indistinct, their secrets folded back into the white. He tucked the pouch into his tunic and stepped onto the road, the vow riding with him in silver and silence. The road bent into shadow as the mountains gathered around it like great cold shoulders. Pines rose in ranks, their trunks black against the snow's blue sheen, and the air thinned to a sharp, glassy taste. Each breath felt measured, as though the mountain was counting him in. By mid-morning, the track narrowed to a ribbon of packed frost, marked by the shallow hoofprints of mules and the occasional drag of a sled runner. The sound of bells reached him long before their source, a slow, deliberate chiming that echoed off the slopes with the patience of centuries. The hospice came into view only when he was nearly upon it, built low into the side of the mountain so that the roof seemed a natural extension of the hillside. Smoke curled from a single vent, disappearing into the wind. A wooden crucifix, weathered pale, stood above the main door, and in its shadow the door itself bore an older carving, a simple square and compass, worn almost smooth by the passing of hands. Here was shelter that knew both faith and craft, a place where survival had long been a quiet collaboration. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of peat smoke and broth. Monks moved with practiced economy, their habits brushing the stone floor as they carried bowls, tended the hearth, or checked the hooves of resting mules in the attached stable. The walls were thick, the light dim, but there was no sense of confinement, only a kind of watchful calm, as though the mountain's gaze had narrowed to this one room. A brother at the hearth looked up, his eyes catching on the frost still crusted along the traveler's cloak. Without a word, he gestured toward a bench near the fire and set a clay mug before him. The steam carried the sharpness of mountain herbs, and as he drank, warmth spread through him in slow, concentric waves. These hospices were lifelines in the passes, founded to aid pilgrims, traders, and the occasional soldier caught by weather or war. Officially, they belonged to the church, but in truth, they belonged to the road itself, serving whoever needed passage. He knew, though no ledger recorded it, that some of these houses had once been kept by men who owed loyalty to the same vow he carried. It was said they passed more than bread and shelter, letters, maps in the form of riddles, coins marked with private signs. While the day wore on, he let his senses rest. The beehive hum of work filled the space, a low chant from the chapel down the hall, the scrape of a ladle in the pot, the soft thud of boots bringing in wood. It was a soundscape designed to ease the traveler into a slower heartbeat, yet behind it lay the knowledge that this was a strategic place. The pass here could be snowed in for months, and whoever controlled its traffic could delay or deliver messages that might tilt the balance of far-off events. He ate with the others at a long table, the broth thickened with barley and the bread coarse, but fresh. Conversation was minimal, the rhythm of chewing and swallowing oddly like prayer. At the far end of the table, a narrow door opened briefly to admit a gust of cold air and a man in a fur-lined cap. He carried a small chest, bound with iron straps, and when he set it down, the thump echoed faintly, as though from inside the stone itself. Later, in the smaller room given to him for the night, he unwrapped the coin from the pass and set it on the sill. The moonlight caught the edge, turning the silver to a thin halo. He imagined how many such objects had passed through this house without notice, tokens of the vow disguised as mere trade goods, relics of an order erased from the surface, but alive in the veins beneath. The coin seemed to listen to the wind outside, as though it recognized the tune. Before sleeping, he walked the hospice's perimeter. Behind the stable, half buried in snow, he found a low doorway leading into the hillside. The lock plate was iron, its keyhole shaped like an elongated hexagon, a design uncommon enough to serve as a signature. He traced it with a gloved finger, feeling the faint warmth of touch even through the metal's chill. No one had opened it today, but the trampled snow suggested it saw use often enough. If it was what he suspected, the door led to a store of supplies for both body and message. Grain sacks and firewood for the road's travelers, coated ledgers and sealed pouches for the road's quieter traffic. In the vow's logic, the two were the same: nourishment against hunger, information against ignorance. Returning inside, he paused in the chapel. The altar cloth was plain, but the candlesticks bore tiny engraved roses at their bases. A sprig of acacia lay in a glass by the window, its green muted in the moonlight. Symbols that would mean nothing to most, but here they were, steady as any saint's image. The flame of a single candle leaned in the draught, then righted itself, a small, stubborn gesture that seemed to echo the vow's own resilience. He slept deeply, the stone walls holding back the wind's sharpest teeth. In dreams, he walked the pass without effort, the snow firm underfoot, the sky so clear the stars looked close enough to pluck like fruit. The constellations were not the ones charted by scholars. They were lines of memory connecting people and places, forming a map no astrolabe could measure. Dawn came with the smell of bread baking and the slow toll of a bell. The monks were already at their work, the rhythm unbroken by his presence. At the threshold, he turned back once, noting how the hospice seemed to grow from the mountain rather than stand upon it. As he stepped into the cold, the bell's echo followed him down the slope, a reminder that in these heights, sanctuary and secrecy often shared the same roof. The pass opened ahead, a white corridor leading toward valleys unseen. Somewhere along that way, the vow would need his hands again, and the coin in his pouch felt heavier in the morning light, not as a burden, but as a proof of purpose. The hospice faded behind him, its smoke thread lost in the pale sky, and the mountain closed its arms once more. The town gathered itself tight around the river, houses leaning shoulder to shoulder, as if bracing for a story the wind might tell. After the pass, the air felt generous here, thicker, warmer, salted only by the memory of snow riding down on the streams. A tavern sat where two streets crossed like sashes, its beams black with long smoke, and its sign a faded stag that looked more like a myth than an animal. From the street you could smell broth, yeast, and oak, and underneath, the hot metal note of a forge, somewhere close, a beehive hum that threaded the neighborhood together. The room they used was above the tap room, reached by a stair that turned twice, as if changing its mind. The door had a lock plate worn by generations of hands. It knew the weight of news and the small tremor of fear. Inside, lamplight collected in shallow bowls of tin and drifted across the ceiling in slow waves. Candles burned low, their flames trimmed to show without shouting. The smoke curled toward the rafters and wrote soft lines on the wood that no clerk would ever sand away. Nothing on the tables invited ink. A square and a compass lay on a shelf, ordinary as bread, though anyone with the right eyes would have seen the way they had been set. Arms open, angles implied, an instrument turned into a sentence. They came in pairs, then alone, then in threes, each finding a place as if assigned by a hand no one could see. A mason's apron darkened by chalk dust. A merchant whose cuffs smelled faintly of clove and damp wool. A widow with a key ring that chimed once when she sat, promise disguised as habit. Our traveler entered with the quiet everyone used here, applauding nothing but attention. In a corner, someone had placed a sprig of something green in a narrow-necked jar. Under lamplight, it might have been acacia, or only a local evergreen that knew the role well enough. They began as such circles did, with presents, not paper. The vow, small and tight as a knot, was acknowledged with the unison silence of people who had practiced listening more than speaking. Beneath the floor, the tavern's evening rhythm rose and fell. Laughter quick as flint, a chair dragging, the soft thud of mugs placed rather than dropped. Those sounds ground the moment, kept it human. Above, the words were rationed, each carrying weight and warmth like coals passed carefully from hand to hand. News was a river that night. A cousin of raids at the temple in Paris, cold as October iron. A clerk in La Rochelle who had stopped dusting his pages with sand when the wrong eyes walked in. A detail that said more than any confession. From the east, rumors with high altitudes on them. Snow-packed. Speaking of travelers who asked for shelter and left behind no names. Only instructions tied into cords at certain intervals. They did not repeat what they already knew. They laid it in place with what they did not. Like stones set into a wall, so the gaps would carry the load as cleverly as the blocks. A single object moved around the table, the old seal ring our traveler had carried since Paris. In the lamplight, the nick on its rim felt like a history lesson you could touch. Each person closed hand over it for a breath, not to bless it or be blessed, but to remember the circle it drew. A red wax wafer lay cooling on a metal plate at the center. They did not stamp it. The wafer was reminder, not mark. Sometimes memory needs a visible empty. The ring without the impression told them all they needed to know about patience. Facts were the bones. They laid one on the table and left it bare before clothing it in rumor. Somewhere in the telling, a mainstream truth settled like a lodestone. Confraternities and craft guilds met privately, often above taverns exactly like this, to settle dues and define conduct. It was ordinary, which made it stronger. Men and women had been gathering in such rooms long before the first vault went up, or the first raiding party found the wrong door. The quirky detail that tucked itself against this truth was small and domestic. A plank tabletop scored with chalk lines, not from accounting but from cipher practice. Short rows of angles and arcs meant for initiation drills when no parchment could be risked. You could wipe them away with water. You could also teach them to a child under the pretext of a counting game. And then the question that could not be cauterized with certainty rose where they all could see it. How much of this practice of signaling, of structuring an idea into degrees of trust, would flow down the years into lodges called by other names? Did these gatherings above taverns become the taproot for the societies scholars would later date to 1717 and beyond? Or were such continuities only the storytelling that secrecy invites? It hovered, generous and unsettled, like lamplight itself. They did not try to trap it beneath glass. Rolls were named without ink, carrier, whose hands knew how to be empty when searched, and how to seem careless when full. Anchor, who stayed, who made the room and the bread and the normalcy that gave cover to uncommon work. Listener, a position often underrated, whose whole purpose was to hold the shape of the story so others could move within it safely. Host, who wore the risk gladly and with good humor. Sentinel, who kept time by bells, not on towers, but in the breath lulls of the street below. And Keeper, who did not write, but remembered. A ledger-turned person, with columns measured in heartbeats and nods. Our traveler spoke into that careful quiet only as much as he had to. The coin from the pass was described without being displayed, its impossible geometry set down with the same restraint used for soup portions and spare lumber. It would be a sign some would read as proof, and others as provocation. Either way, it belonged under the skin of the circle for now, not on top of the table. What mattered more than the silver was the fact that a mark could travel broader than any border, accumulating meanings it was never asked to carry, yet still reflecting its first purpose when the right eyes looked. Outside, snow began to tape the windows in thin, slanted lines, grit in the wind, scratching at the glass, like a quill gone blunt. The hour lengthened, and the room's warmth thickened into something like protection. A candle guttered, the smoke writing a question mark that resolved into a straight line as the wick righted itself. The square and compass on the shelf cast long, coupled shadows against the far wall. The coupled angles looked like a doorway more than a tool. Tools are like that. In one room they measure, in another they mean. Keys changed hands without theatrics. A small ring of them, larder, gate, lower stair, loft, rested briefly in our traveler's palm. Metal holds the day's temperature, and these felt like the room, human warm, prepared to be cold if need be. He thought of locks, not as defenses but as choreography, when to open, how much, for whom, and for how long. A key can be a sentence with a period or a sentence that never quite ends. They rehearsed a route using nothing but gestures, wrist angles that drew streets, finger taps that marked doors, a tilt of the head that made a stable into a waypoint. When the tavern below shifted into a last round, the hum softening, a chair scraping, then stillness. The circle rose with it, as if the house itself were a bell pulling them to the close. No oath was recited aloud. The vow lived below language tonight, in the careful way mugs were lifted from the table, in the decision to leave no crumbs. Before leaving, each person touched the red wax wafer, cool now, ringless, a small planet that had not been given a moon. The touch was enough. The wafer would never be stamped. It would be remelted tomorrow into a new day's seal for bread deliveries or a midwife's letter requesting herbs. Nothing wasted, not even symbol. When he stepped back onto the stair, the wood spoke under his weight in a single, satisfied note. The door closed, and the lock plate accepted its role, an iron punctuation shaped by a craftsman who had no idea his work would keep such sentences safe. The street wore its hush like a cloak. Snow made the lanterns look farther away than they were. He tucked the rolls and routes into the place where the vow lives, not written, not erased. Down the block, the forge's fire sank into coals that kept their own counsel. Somewhere, an owl settled into a barn beam and blinked, one eye then the other, a measured permission for the night to continue. The town's river turned under a thin skin of ice, an old habit rehearsing another winter. In the mind's map, a new room existed now, where none had before, its door easy to pass if you knew how not to look at it. The stair behind him held a draft in the shape of words, not yet spoken. Tomorrow, they would gather again in a different house to do what this night had prepared, speak the articles they would refuse to write, strike their sparks against the damp and call it design. The candle's last thread of smoke drew a line he could almost follow with a finger, and then the air took it, and the line went where such lines go, forward. The house chosen for this meeting stood at the far edge of the town, where cobbled streets gave way to rutted tracks, and the river slowed into a black, glassy bend. Its shutters were drawn, though the night was calm, and the lamp over the door had been left unlit, a sign as deliberate as any posted notice. Only those who had traced the gesture route from the tavern knew to enter. Others might pass it by as an empty dwelling awaiting spring repairs. Inside, the air carried the familiar perfume of wood smoke and beeswax, but tonight it also held a sharper note, pine resin, heated in a small brazier. The resin's sweetness masked other scents and kept the cold from settling too deep in the walls. Around a table barely large enough for the company, the first circle had gathered again, their faces softened by lamplight and shadow. On the table lay nothing of parchment or ink. Tonight was for words that could not risk the paper. The keeper began, not with a greeting, but with a slow, deliberate knotting of a cord. Each twist and loop marked a clause. Each tightening fixed it in memory. Those who had sworn the vow before followed along silently, their fingers ghosting the motions in their laps. The pattern would live in muscle and mind, impossible to confiscate unless the person themselves was taken. And even then, a trained silence could erase it. The first clause was simple: preserve the balance. It had survived from the temple's early rules, a recognition that power not held in check corrodes its holder. The second, protect the work before the name. If a banner must burn to save the ledger, let the banner burn. The third, pass knowledge in forms that can change shape. A list may become a rhyme, a map may become a story, a cipher may become the stitching on a sailcloth. He listened as the circle's voices braided these principles into something both older and new. They spoke of the Paris arrests as a kind of fire that had burned away illusion, leaving only the core; of La Rochelle's vanished fleet, fact or fable, as proof that disappearance could be a strategy, not a defeat; of the coin from the pass, resting even now in his pouch, as a reminder that symbols could travel centuries if carried in the right silence. The room's warmth deepened as they moved through the articles, the lamplight throwing long, fluid shadows on the plaster. Outside, the river's slow bend caught the moonlight and reflected it through the shutters in thin, shifting bars. It painted the table in fragments, as though to remind them that no charter is whole all at once. It is made in pieces, passed through hands, each bearer adding their own light. One by one, the circle's members recited their assigned portions, careful to keep the phrasing constant. Memory works like weaving. Each repetition tightens the thread, reduces the gaps. When a novice stumbled over a line, the others did not correct aloud. Instead, the keeper retied that section of the cord, letting the knot itself serve as the prompt. The novice repeated the line without further error. A mainstream fact underpinned their ritual, hidden in plain sight. Oral statutes had been used for centuries where the written word was too vulnerable, among persecuted sects, in guilds protecting their craft, in courts where a single slip of ink could condemn. Here, that same practice was their spine. The quirky detail that clung to it tonight was the cord itself, not hemp or leather, but a thin braid of horsehair, supple and resilient, with a faint sheen when the light caught it. Someone had gone to the trouble of dyeing it the warm red of sealing wax, so that even in the absence of the ring, the seal lived in their hands. The question that lingered, as it always did, was whether such an unwritten charter could truly survive the long winters ahead. Would it fade as members died, or distort into something unrecognizable when passed too far from its origin? The circle did not answer. Instead, they accepted the risk as part of the vow. Permanence was not the point, only persistence. If the shape shifted but the balance held, then the work endured. At a signal from the sentinel, a double tap of knuckles on the table, they moved to the closing rite. Each placed a hand flat on the wood, fingertips just touching their neighbors. The cord lay coiled in the center like a sleeping snake. The keeper gathered it up, looped it once, and hung it on a peg by the hearth. It would stay there, in plain sight, until the next meeting, a piece of innocent tack among other household tools. A log in the hearth collapsed, sending a small storm of sparks upward. The flames bent toward the resin pot, filling the air with a sweeter smoke that clung to their hair and clothes. Later, if questioned, they could say truthfully they had been by a hearth on a cold night. No one could smell the difference between warmth and witness. When it was time to go, they left in pairs, slipping out the back into the narrow lane that followed the river's curve. The water there was dark and slow, whispering against its banks as if practicing their clauses. He walked with the widow who carried the keys. They spoke of the weather, the price of salt, the stubborn mule in her yard. Beneath those harmless words, they confirmed the next meeting place, a mill house where the wheel turned slowly enough to be heard from the far bank. At the corner, they parted without looking back. The moon had climbed higher, silvering the frost on the cobbles and picking out the faint lines of cart tracks. He kept to the edge where the shadows of the houses fell deepest, letting the night's cold sharpen his senses. The coin at his side was a small, steady weight. In his mind, the new knots of the charter settled into place, each one a bead on an invisible thread stretching back to that chapel morning in Paris. By the time he reached his lodging, the shutters were closed and the fire banked low. He sat for a moment in the dark, replaying the cadence of the circle's voices, the way each article had found its echo in another's mouth. The vow was heavier tonight, but not in burden, heavier like a rope pulled taut, holding firm across a widening distance. Outside, the river kept its pace toward the sea, carrying the night's reflections with it. He imagined the current taking their words downstream, scattering them into ripples and eddies until they were indistinguishable from the rest of the water. That was the point, to be everywhere and nowhere, to let the charter live in the flow rather than in a single place. He banked the thought like a fire for the long road ahead. The next town lay in a shallow valley, its streets coiling inward toward a market square, where a stone well marked the center. Around it, houses leaned in as though eager to overhear. The well's lip was polished smooth from centuries of hands, and the water at its bottom glimmered faintly with coins cast in for luck. Above the square, an old guild hall cast its shadow like a lid. Its facade carried carvings long softened by rain, crossed tools, garlands, a face whose eyes had been worn away but whose mouth still seemed to whisper. It was in the guild hall's loft that he found it. The loft itself was an odd room, neither wholly public nor entirely private, accessible by a creaking stair that ended at a door without a latch. A half-moon window looked down on the square, giving the impression of an unblinking watcher. The floorboards were scarred, with the weight of benches long since removed, but the dust was too evenly spread to be the work of neglect. Someone kept this place in a kind of quiet readiness. On a shelf in the far corner sat a shallow box of oak, its lid pushed half open. Inside, scraps of parchment lay between folded cloths, the edges curled but the ink still legible in places. And there, on one strip of vellum, was the impression, a circle of red wax pressed with a seal that was not complete. The outer ring was perfect, its rim smooth and deliberate. The cross within, however, stopped at its midpoint, as if the stamp had been lifted before the wax could take the full image. He turned the scrap in his hand, letting the light from the half-moon window pass across the surface. Even unfinished, the seal had authority. The lines it did hold were crisp. The wax blended with some resin that gave it a subtle sheen. The missing half was absence by choice, he thought, not accident. A seal that hinted at its origin without confessing it entirely. To an outsider, it would seem flawed. To someone bound by the vow, it was a signal. Here is the mark, but not the whole of it. There was a fact in this, if one knew where to look. Seals in Europe had always served to authenticate, to prove identity, to close documents, to certify a bond. They were trusted because they were hard to fake, and because breaking them left an undeniable trace. The quirky detail here was that imperfect impressions were sometimes kept as talismans, carried as tokens of allegiance or memory. This one, incomplete yet preserved, was like a conversation paused mid-sentence. The question it raised lingered. Could such a transitional emblem be the bridge between two eras, the Templar cross and some later, more ambiguous sign? If the missing half were filled with another symbol entirely, might it become something new, without losing what it had been? The wax did not answer, but its silence was the kind that draws you closer. Beneath the box, he found a strip of leather, worn and softened to the point of translucence at its bends. A small notch had been cut into one edge, exactly the kind of flaw he knew from the old ring's rim. It was not the ring itself, but it had been pressed against it, perhaps as a trial, perhaps to confirm alignment before the seal was made. He slipped it into his pouch beside the coin, the two relics settling together like matched stones in a wall. The loft's air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of beeswax gone cold. On the wall, a square and compass had been chalked at some point and then rubbed away, leaving only a ghostly outline. He traced it with his finger, feeling how the wood grain had resisted the erasure. Symbols once impressed are difficult to remove entirely. Even when the image fades, the texture remains. Through the window he saw the market winding down, stalls closing like books, voices lowering to the evening register. A bell rang somewhere beyond the hill, its tone round and calm. He thought of the corded knots of the unwritten charter, the way they carried a whole body of knowledge without a single written line. The half-finished seal was its twin in wax, a visual form that declared, "There is more," without revealing what that more was. The Guildhall's stair groaned as he descended, the sound absorbed by the thick beams and the smell of old timber. Outside, the square was washed in the last light, the well at its center catching a glimmer that turned each tossed coin into a brief star. He walked past it, noting a girl leaning over to make her wish. Her coin flashed, spun, and vanished into the water's black surface. Wishes and seals, he thought, both vanish from sight the moment they're made, yet both can travel far in unseen currents. At the edge of the square, a mason was packing away his tools. His mallet bore a shallow nick near the handle, a flaw smoothed by years of work. The mason caught his glance and gave a nod. Not recognition, not exactly, but the mutual courtesy of men who keep their trades in their hands rather than their mouths. It was the same language spoken by the half-finished seal, the deliberate choice to leave something unsaid, knowing the right eyes will understand. The road out of town curved along the river, the water sluggish with the weight of winter's approach. He felt the pouch against his side, coin, leather strip, and the memory of the seal, all pressing their silent stories into him. Together they were fragments, but fragments could still align into a pattern. It was a pattern that did not need to be completed all at once. Its power lay in its ability to wait. Night fell with a slow thickening of the air. He followed the river's bend until the lights of the town were hidden by the trees. Somewhere ahead, another meeting place would open its door to the vow, and perhaps another piece of the seal's missing half would appear. Not in wax, but in the shared understanding that passes between those who speak without speaking. Behind him, the Guildhall's loft sat quiet, its window watching the square with the patience of something that has kept a secret for longer than any living memory. The wax impression rested in its box, neither whole nor broken, its absence as deliberate as its presence. And in that balance, it held the same quiet defiance as the vow itself. The winter journey took him from stone valleys to the flatter lands where cities rose like carefully laid chessboards. Here the roads were straighter, the fields cut into measured rectangles, and the air carried the faint brass of bells from towers that belonged as much to rulers as to churches. The next part of his path did not lead to a tavern loft or a riverside mill, but into the softened corridors of a ducal court, places where power wore silk and perfume instead of armor, and words could weigh more than steel. The palace at the city's center was a layered thing, outer courtyards of cold flagstone, inner gardens where orange trees huddled under winter cloths, and a great hall whose ceiling seemed to drift above the heads of those who walked there. He passed through each space like an ink stroke moving toward its intended sentence, careful not to blot or hurry. Courtiers moved in clusters, their conversations an embroidery of flattery, rumor, and intent. Behind the words, the vow's quiet purpose had its own threads. In these courts, a fact was clear to anyone patient enough to see it. Surviving networks from the old order had learned to work in velvet shadows. A sword might not be welcome here, but influence moved like candle smoke, curling around obstacles, unseen unless caught in the right light. The quirky detail lay in the way such influence announced itself. A scented letter slipped into a sleeve during a dance, its fragrance acting as both signature and cipher. Each scent had a meaning to those in the know: rosemary for safe passage, clove for funds secured, lavender for wait until spring. He followed a lady-in-waiting down a side corridor, the muffled hush of their steps soaked up by woven carpets patterned with geometric designs. Each design was a work of art to most eyes. To others, it was a map of allegiances, a layout of alliances too dangerous to speak. They arrived at a small withdrawing room, its walls paneled in walnut, the air warmer than the hall outside. Two figures were already there. a minor lord known for his skill in diplomacy, and a merchant whose ships were said to fly more than one flag depending on the port. On the table between them sat a small casket of dark wood. The merchant opened it just enough for a flash of gold to catch the lamplight before closing it again. The gesture was enough to start the real conversation, not about coins, but about the work those coins would finance, a loan to an army that was not officially recognized, a grant to a monastery with a suspiciously well-equipped scriptorium, the quiet rescue of documents from a crumbling tower. Every coin would have a public story. The private one belonged to the vow. He took his place at the table and listened. In these rooms, the unspoken was often louder than what was said. A slight lift of an eyebrow could mean agreement. A measured sip of wine could signal caution. The deliberate setting down of a cup could end a line of discussion entirely. The vow adapted to this language as easily as it had to coded knots and chalked roots. Here the knots were in phrasing. Here the chalk was in the pause between sentences. They spoke of news from Paris, the raids still sending ripples through lesser courts. The minor lord suggested that the sudden confiscations had left gaps in more than just the king's enemies' ranks. Gaps in supply, in banking, in the complex machinery that kept kingdoms moving. "Nature abhors a vacuum," he said, turning his cup so the handle faced the merchant. The merchant nodded, touching the rim with 2 fingers, and the room understood. New arrangements were already in place. From his seat, he could see a tapestry covering most of one wall. It showed a hunting scene, deer fleeing through a forest, dogs in pursuit. But in the pattern of the trees, someone had woven a subtle square and compass motif, repeated at intervals so irregular it could not be mere decoration. The weaver, whoever they were, had left a signature legible only to those tuned to it. Symbols, once stitched into the fabric, stayed even if the viewer did not notice them. The conversation wound toward its close, with the distribution of certain items. A folded scrap of paper no bigger than a hand, passed to him under the pretense of sharing a sweetmeat. A tiny silver key, pressed into his palm with the warmth of a farewell clasp. A perfumed ribbon that would mark an upcoming gathering. Each object was both ordinary and charged, like the half-finished seal he carried in memory. They were part of a vocabulary the vow had been expanding for generations. The question that trailed him out of the room was one the court itself could not answer. How deeply did these velvet currents run into the foundations of power? Were they the occasional whisper in a ruler's ear, or had they braided themselves into the very spine of governance? The answer would remain uncertain, but uncertainty was its own form of shelter. As long as the question could not be resolved, the vow could move in its shadow. Outside the withdrawing room, the court's life resumed its glitter. Musicians played in the great hall, the air heavy with the mingling of candle wax and orange blossom. He walked the long gallery toward the exit, noting the niches where statues stood, saints, kings, philosophers. One of them, a marble figure of an architect holding a scroll, had an eye carved so finely it seemed to watch him pass. For a heartbeat, it felt as if the eye followed, not in threat, but in recognition. He left the palace through a side gate, the night air crisp and smelling faintly of snow to come. In the quiet street beyond, a coach rattled past, its curtains drawn tight. A man on foot hurried in the opposite direction, carrying a case shaped for documents. All around, life moved in its ordinary rhythms, but the residue of the court's whispers stayed with him, like the lingering trace of rosemary on the air. The moon sat low over the rooftops, casting the streets in silver geometry. He thought of the tapestry's hidden pattern, the symbols in the weave that most would miss. Power in courts, he knew, was much the same, an intricate design hidden beneath the visible hunt. The vow's role was not to redraw that pattern, but to understand it, and, when needed, to nudge a single thread so the whole picture shifted, almost imperceptibly, in their favor. With the key in his pocket and the perfumed ribbon tucked into his coat, he turned toward his next destination, where velvet and silk would give way to paper and ink, and the whispers of courts would merge with the murmurs of the street. Somewhere ahead, the next door in this chain waited for the right hand to open it. The door answered the key with a soft throat clearing of tumblers, and the stair beyond breathed paper and damp stone. It felt like the continuation of the court's whisper, lowered one more register until it became the hum of work. He went down carefully, palm to wall, counting the shallow tool marks as if they were prayer beads. The room at the bottom was already warm, its heat a furnace of purpose, the air thick with ink and the slight metallic scent of type. The press stood at the room's center like a patient animal, ribs of oak fitted with iron sinew. Beside it, the compositor's case waited, tiny apartments of letters in blackened wood, the alphabet sliced into workaday fragments. In one corner, a rose, crudely painted, marked the stair, a sign for discretion as old as anyone could remember. The candle flames leaned as the pressman pulled, then settled back, breathing with the machine's rhythm, as if the whole room were a chest. Here the vow translated itself into pamphlets and broadsheets, short enough to be carried between sleeve and wrist, sharp enough to make a crowd tilt as one. A mainstream truth lay in the noise of the platen. In the 17th and 18th centuries, printed words, pamphlets, libels, cheap sheets hawked in markets could move opinion faster than any writer. The peculiar quirk clinging to that truth was older than censorship itself, printers timing their releases to market days, when a single copy could turn into 100 mouths by nightfall, and bakers' queues became rumor mills where flour dust settled on dangerous sentences. He watched the pressman dust a fresh page with sand to draw the wet shine, the grains glittering like ground glass before dulling into nothing. They worked with the beehive hum he had heard in lodges and hospices, quiet industry masking intent. On the table lay a stack of forms, their mirror letters locked tight in a frame. He traced one line without touching it, reading backward until the sentence resolved in the mind's eye. No grand manifestos. These were small tilts, a tax described as a hunger, a levy named in the shape of a winter, a brief litany of injustices arranged to sound like an accidental chorus when read aloud by market criers. The vow preferred such angles, force applied, where habit made structures fragile. Outside, the city's day began to mount its volume. Hawkers' calls braided with the rumble of carts, the clank of buckets, a dog's bark snagging on a gate. The window grates held the room to shadow, but the sound rose through the stones like tide. He folded packets while the press climbed its slow hill again and again, red wax cooling on each packet's twine into a ring, more suggestion than sign. The old seal was used sparingly now, The smudge of its history could be read too easily by the wrong reader. Rings without crosses traveled faster. The plan for the day was not complex. It rarely needed to be. The first circle had charted a path of distribution that turned on ordinary motion. A woman with a basket, a boy with a milk pail, a broom leaning in the right doorway. Street corners and church porches, the exchange outside a bakehouse where steam made breath visible, each a hinge. The sentinel would listen for a particular bell sequence from the far chapel. 3 close together, 1 pause, 2 more, and the signal would loosen the day into action. The push to come had nothing of heroics about it. Heroes make a noise. This would be felt instead as a nudge that arrived as if from the city itself. The first packets went out with the sweepers, bristle on stone, scarifying the frost, while hands exchanged weight for weight. The press never stopped. Its pace was human, not frantic, a metronome reminding them to keep the breath regular. A candle guttered and corrected. Smoke drew a soft question mark and then straightened into a line. He thought of the court tapestry, the hidden square and compass stitched into the forest, and felt the kinship between textile and text, both looms for arranging the world. The debated matter hovered at the edge of the room like another person not yet introduced. Were such stirrings the product of a deliberate hand, or did they only give direction to discontent that would have risen anyway? In some seasons, the smallest provocation can turn a line of customers at a bakery into a moving chorus, bread becoming the blunt instrument of grievance. Historians would argue later whether a secret circle set those hours in motion or merely held out a map when people demanded to walk. He carried the question without trying to lock it shut. Ambiguity was part of the vow's shelter. When the bell sequence finally came, 3, a pause, then 2, its sound slid down the stair with a civility that made gooseflesh regardless. The pressman covered the form as if putting a child to nap. The room exhaled once and rose. Packets found pockets, sleeves, the hollow between apron and dress. The door opened to a brightness that felt both innocent and conspiratorial. He walked the route he'd rehearsed with gestures in the tavern loft, falling in behind the market's forward lean. Stalls had grown crowded by the time he reached the square. The smell of hot wine and damp wool made a somber sweetness in the air. A crier's voice climbed a step stool, hawking the weather report and a lost hat in the same tone. Beneath his arm, a bundle of broadsheets offered a different kind of forecast. He placed a packet on the upturned lip of a barrel and moved on without breaking pace. Behind him, fingers found it. Hands split it clean. Paper fanned into a dozen directions like starlings. The words themselves had been tuned not to shout, but to harmonize with thoughts already gnawing at the bone of the day. They suggested that a levy was an invisible hand removing 1 loaf from each family's table, easier to imagine than a percentage. They named a debt in the measure of winter nights without enough wood. A margin held a small cut of a rose, barely a thorn, and those who knew would smile and fold it twice before tucking it away. Others read and passed it on as if passing a lamp along a dark hallway. He moved along the arc of the square, feeling the tilt begin. Not a riot, a shift. Lines at the bakers lengthened and grew noisier, not with rage, but with the peculiar solidarity of shared arithmetic. A constable's pace slowed as he tried to listen to 2 corners at once. A magistrate's runner hesitated in the lee of a pillar, torn between orders and a sudden need to count how many hands were holding the same sheet. For a quarter hour, the city's rhythm fluttered. Then it steadied, differently. That was the point. Not escalation, not spectacle, but a small realignment of weight that would press on a docket later, or on a ledger, or in the back of a duke's mind when he turned toward an advisor with a scented letter and a question needing delay. The push became memory, even as it was happening. He paused in a church porch out of the drifting snow, the packets now gone, the twine ends tickling his sleeve like whiskers. A votive candle grid burned low, each wick a little rumor of flame. He lit one and watched the puddle of wax widen. The red ring around its base softened, bled toward the stone, left the faint circle that would outlast the flame. Some symbols served best when they were nearly gone. Down the nave, a memorial slab carried the features of a builder, squared jaw set above a scroll. The carving had weathered to a generalized serenity, but the eye, one eye only, had been cut deep enough to hold a shadow even in this gray light. It did not glare. It watched. The sight drew a line from the day's pamphlets to something older and steadier, an idea that buildings can tutor the conscience the way texts attempt to. Moral architecture, angles not for walls alone, but for conduct. Outside, the square exhaled into afternoon. The broadsheets would spend the evening on mantelpieces and brewery tables, and by morning they would be kindling, or liners for baskets, or precisely folded inside prayer books. He walked away from the press's basement pulse toward streets where stone spoke in larger sentences. The snow had begun to stick to cornices and the thin sills of carved windows, whitening eyebrows over stone faces. He let the city slow him. The emotional spike of the hour subsided, leaving the soft tremor of work well placed. Boots clicked, children dragged sticks along palings. A cooper's hoop rolled free of a cart and came to rest against his foot like a tame animal. He set it upright and watched it wobble to stillness, a circle finding its balance without instruction. At the corner, he turned toward a lane that opened like a mouth onto a square, held in orbit by a single building. Its facade rose not in ornament, but in proportion, each window a measured beat, each pilaster a rib in a chest, both human and civic. Above the door, a carved triangle sheltered an eye cut with an artisan's restraint, as if petitioning rather than proclaiming. He felt, standing there, the press's cadence shift into stone, words hardened into form that could steady a city's breath. The key in his pocket weighed less, and the ribbon from the court lay cool against his chest. The night would bring another room, but for now the lesson was outdoors, written in lime and light. The candle of the afternoon sank a fraction, and the eye in the pediment took the shade like a pupil. He stepped forward, letting the architecture gather him as a thought gathers its conclusion, and the city's measured face invited him to consider what sort of conscience a wall could keep. The building stood like a thought too clear to be spoken aloud. No heraldry, no riot of saints, no crowded friezes, only proportion, line, and shadow. The stone had mellowed from white to a honeyed gray, as if the seasons had been painting it with their patience. Above the portico, the pediment held a single device, an open triangle sheltering an eye so finely cut that it seemed to moisten under the pale winter light. He lingered on the square's far side at first, letting the geometry settle in his vision. The facade was not monumental in size, yet it carried the calm gravity of something built to last beyond empires. Each column met its capital with a transition so seamless It felt like the stone itself had decided to grow upward. The steps rose in an odd rhythm, 3 shallow, 1 deep, 3 shallow again. An architect's wink to those counting. Fact first, in early modern Europe, the all-seeing eye began appearing in civic and religious architecture alike, not yet the exclusive symbol it would later become. It signified divine providence, enlightenment, or the guiding principle of reason, depending on the patron. The quirky detail here was that some Masons, particularly those with ties to outlawed orders, would alter the carving ever so slightly, the eye's gaze not fixed forward, but angled just enough to meet the viewer's own, breaking the standard canon. And the question, which historians still dispute, is whether these deviations were merely the artisan's whim or intentional signals to a fellowship moving beneath the city's daylight. He crossed the square slowly, boots tapping the cobbles with the same rhythm as the steps. On the building's threshold, the air seemed to shift, cooler, though the day was windless. Inside, light pooled from high windows, falling in measured rectangles onto the polished floor. The echo of his footsteps spread evenly, no corner of the hall hoarding more sound than another. This was architecture as discipline, a room that taught you how to move, how to speak, even how to breathe. The custodian, a man whose hair seemed as much part of the building as the marble, appeared from a side door. He spoke little, only nodded toward the gallery that ringed the hall's upper level. From there, the eye in the pediment could be seen from behind, a hollow recess, its carving revealed as a careful interplay of depth and shadow. The back of the stone bore a mason's mark, 2 intersecting arcs, faint as breath on glass. He traced it with his gaze, recognizing the same geometry as the chalked compass on a hospice wall months ago. A ledger sat open on a lectern in the gallery, its script neat but unhurried. Names, dates, and donations filled the columns, but at intervals there were symbols instead of text, simple shapes, repeated in no discernible pattern. A circle beside a date, a square in the margin of a name, triangles next to certain sums. The custodian closed the ledger without comment, but not before his fingers lingered on a page, marked with the same half-finished seal in the corner. From a bench near the southern window, he watched the play of light across the floor. As the sun tilted west, the illuminated rectangles slid until they aligned perfectly with the hall's inlaid patterns. An 8-pointed star here, a compass rose there. For one brief minute, the triangle of light from the window fell across the exact center of the star, and the room seemed to draw a breath. Then, the moment passed, and the light moved on, a reminder that even in stone, timing mattered. In the hush that followed, his mind looped back to the court tapestry's hidden motifs, the rose painted on the printer's stair, the notch in the leather strip from the Guildhall loft. Here, the symbols were not hidden so much as embedded, woven into the building's ratios, waiting for eyes that knew how to read them. The building itself was the pamphlet, the charter, the seal. Its audience might be centuries late in arriving, but it would still be here to greet them. He descended the steps backward, unwilling to turn his back on the facade, until he reached the bottom. Across the square, a boy chased a rolling hoop, the arc of its path sketching the same curves as the mason's mark. A woman at a bread stall wrapped loaves in paper printed with a faint sunburst watermark. Every detail felt deliberate, as though the square itself was part of a wider design whose draftsman remained unseen. The question persisted. Was the eye watching for danger, or for the one it was meant to recognize? He could not tell, and perhaps that was the point. In the vow's language, sensum en raus, symbols worked best when they could be both invitation and warning. He left the square by its eastern street, the sunlight catching briefly on the pediment stone. For an instant, the carved iris glimmered, as though reflecting more than daylight, perhaps the glint of a fleet's vanished sails, or the sheen of wax cooling on an unfinished seal. Whatever it was, it followed him into the narrowing streets ahead, an unseen architect's blessing, or reminder, or both. The sea had a way of smudging time, of making the present look older and the past seem freshly arrived. Venice floated in that blur, a city of water and stone, where every facade carried the tide's handwriting. Its salt-bitten arches leaned toward each other across narrow canals, and bridges crossed like stitched seams between pieces of a vast patchwork garment. Even the air here was layered. Brine and damp mortar, fish and incense, the faint sweetness of rotting wood. He arrived under a sky the color of tarnished silver, stepping off the boat onto worn flagstones that held the slipperiness of centuries. Gondolas swayed gently at their moorings, each prow's iron comb reflecting the ripple of passing light. The city was already a debate in a way, between land and water, permanence and change. It was the perfect stage for the other debate he had come to witness. The gathering was not in a hall of government, nor in any palazzo famed for its art. Instead, it took place in a merchant's library, 3 floors above a narrow fondamenta where the lapping water was close enough to touch from the windows. The room smelled of vellum and seaweed. Scrolls and codices lined the shelves in no apparent order, though the owner swore there was a system older than the Republic itself. Around a long table, 5 scholars, 3 from the city, 2 from abroad, sat with their papers and their certainty. They were here to discuss an event 4 generations past, a private meeting of financiers, sea captains, and exiled knights, held in Venice during a week when the Doge was ill and the city's councils were in confusion. Some claimed it was the true moment when the scattered remnants of the Templar network aligned with merchant dynasties, setting the course for a century of discreet economic manipulation. Others dismissed it as a story inflated by coincidence and paranoia. A mainstream fact anchored the discussion. Venice, in the late medieval and early modern period, was the nerve center of European trade, its influence stretching from the eastern Mediterranean to the North Sea. Control here meant leverage everywhere. The quirky detail was that the city's water gates, closed to outsiders after sundown, could be opened for the right ship if its captain carried a small wooden token carved with a compass rose. Surviving examples were rare. Most had been burned or lost, as if to erase the habit from memory. The central question, still debated in hushed academic journals, was whether one such nocturnal opening had let in more than cargo. Did a certain ship, unregistered in the state's logs, moor quietly in a private basin and unload passengers who would later shape the flow of capital from the shadows? The evidence was as slippery as the paving stones after rain. A ledger entry in a banker's hand, a cryptic letter to a Florentine cousin, a water-stained charter half in Latin, half in code. The scholars' voices rose and fell like the tide itself, One insisted that the so-called Venetian meeting was nothing but a convenient myth retrofitted to explain unrelated events. Another countered with maps showing trade routes that had shifted overnight, as if by a single, unseen decision. The third read aloud from a letter found in an attic in Lucca, where the writer warned his brother to watch the lion's eye, for it now sees beyond the lagoon. He sat back, letting their words layer like the city's smells, each adding its own note to the air. Beneath the arguments, he could hear the rhythm of the vow, the preference for plausible deniability, the careful spacing of truths and fictions so that they reinforced each other. The meeting they debated might have happened exactly as some claimed, or it might never have taken place at all. Either way, its shadow had altered the shape of things. From the tall window he watched a gondola slide by, the oar dipping soundlessly into the green water. Across the canal, a small stone lion jutted from a wall, its carved eyes eroded, but still angled toward the horizon. The sight made him think of the architect's eye carved in the pediment far away, and of the half-finished seal pressed into wax. The vow's symbols seemed to travel better than any ship, crossing from land to water without losing their meaning. The debate in the room showed no sign of conclusion. As evening crept in, the tide rose, to slap softly against the foundations, a sound that filled the silences between arguments. One scholar pointed out that the compass rose tokens could be arranged on a table to match the positions of stars on a certain date, a pattern that, if true, would set the Venetian meeting in the same week as a rare lunar alignment. Another dismissed it as romantic nonsense. When the light faded, the merchant lit a brass lamp. Its glow turned the sea-stained walls to warm amber, and for a moment the room looked like it might have on the night in question. Scholars replaced by captains and bankers, maps spread instead of papers, the air full of salt and intent. Then the vision dissolved, and the present returned. He left them to their argument, descending the narrow stair into the sound of water. Outside, the street was more canal than paving, and he followed it until it joined the Grand Canal's broad, black ribbon. Lanterns floated in the reflections, their light breaking on the ripples into symbols no one could keep still long enough to read. Somewhere out there, in the tangle of water and stone, the truth about that meeting might still exist, in a ledger locked in a salt-proof chest, in a memory passed from master to apprentice, in the curve of a bridge built to honor an unspoken alliance. Or perhaps, like Venice itself, it survived best by being a little of both, fact and fable, each lending the other buoyancy. The road away from Venice followed the river inland, where the water's pull was less a tide and more a steady persuasion. Along these banks, towns had risen not for defense or beauty, but for the quiet arithmetic of commerce. Warehouses faced the quays like blunt-nosed ships run aground, their shutters wide to the air, their floors smelling of hemp, grain, and coin. He came to one such town as winter began to loosen its grip. The market square was already awake, merchants laying out scales beside their goods, silver and copper clinking in the morning chill. It was here, in such ordinary spaces, that the first banks of Europe had found their footing, not in gilded halls, but in the shade of arcades where moneylenders' benches stood ready for the day's bargains. The mainstream fact was plain. Many of the earliest recognizable banking institutions in Europe grew from the practices of medieval merchant guilds and money changers, some of which had direct or indirect ties to military orders like the Templars. Their ledgers recorded debts across continents, often backed by a network of trust rather than physical coin. The quirk within that truth was a habit known only to a few initiates: the deliberate misbinding of ledgers. Certain entries would be copied into a separate book, one page ahead or behind the true date, creating a shadow record that only those with the correct key could reconcile. It was a trick both of accounting and of allegiance, an extra layer between the vows dealings and the prying eyes of kings. He found the man he sought at a bench beneath a striped awning. The banker was unremarkable in dress, his sleeves rolled to keep ink off the cuffs, his fingers smudged from years of turning pages. Yet when their eyes met, there was the faintest nod, as though greeting not the traveler before him, but the network behind him. From beneath the counter, the banker produced a folded slip of parchment. Its seal was small and plain, but the wax bore that deliberate imperfection he had seen before. An edge left slightly rough, as if resisting finality. They spoke in the language of figures, the conversation a steady exchange of sums, rates, and terms. Yet within it, certain numbers carried weight beyond their arithmetic. A payment due in 7 could mean an alliance sealed in a week. An interest rate of 3 might signal a third party's involvement. To the untrained ear it was business. To them it was choreography. As the banker tallied, he mused on the debated question that always lingered at the edge of such meetings. Was the rise of modern banking an unintended consequence of Templar dissolution, or its quiet continuation under other names? Some argued that the skill and infrastructure, routes, trusted agents, secure places of deposit, were too valuable to vanish, simply folding into the fabric of mercantile Europe. Others insisted that the new banks owed nothing to the old order beyond coincidence, and that any perceived continuity was the invention of romantic minds and conspiracy seekers. The banker slid the slip of parchment across the counter. Inside was not a contract, but a map. Thin lines showing rivers and roads, tiny marks at intervals. Each mark corresponded to a name in the banker's personal ledger, each name to a place where coin could be exchanged without receipt. The marks formed a shape, not unlike the compass rose carved on the long vanished tokens of Venice. He folded it once, twice, and let it vanish into his sleeve. In the square, a boy darted between stalls, carrying a tray of steaming rolls. The smell of yeast and smoke curled through the air, mingling with the sharper scent of metal. A goldsmith's hammer rang from a nearby shop, the rhythm steady as a heartbeat. It reminded him of the press in the basement room, the way each impression of the platen carried its own message into the city. Here, each strike on the anvil was another entry in an unwritten account, wealth shaping itself under the guise of craft. Before he left, the banker reached for a small chest beneath the bench. From it, he withdrew a coin unlike the others in his till. One side bore the familiar cross, the other was worn almost smooth, save for the faint suggestion of an eye. He placed it in the traveler's palm without explanation. It was heavier than it looked, its edges softened by years of passing hand to hand. He understood at once: currency as message, coin as oath. The sun was lowering when he took the road again, the parchment and coin secure against his chest. Behind him, the market continued in its ordinary music. Bargains struck, goods weighed, disputes settled with a handshake or a nod. But he knew that beneath the clatter of trade ran another current, quieter and more enduring, its arithmetic written not in numbers, but in trust, favor, and the shared silence of those bound by the vow. By the time he reached the bridge at the town's edge, the river below had caught the last gold of the day. He paused, leaning on the parapet, watching the water carry its silt and reflections toward the sea. Somewhere downstream it would pass Venice, and further still, the open waters where a vanished fleet had once sailed. The river did not keep ledgers. It remembered by flowing. He walked on into the lengthening shadow, the thought of the banker's coin and misbound ledger turning over in his mind like the slow revolutions of a mill wheel. In both, there was the same principle: motion that seems ordinary until you notice what it is turning toward. And in that quiet turn lay the echo of the past, still shaping the arithmetic of the present. The directions were less a route than a sequence of sensations: the smell of leather and rainwater, the muffled echo of boots on wood, a door that looked older than the wall it was set into. He followed them through a narrow street that seemed to inhale as he entered. Its windows shuttered, though it was still early afternoon. At the lane's end, a modest building leaned slightly toward the canal, its bricks scarred by salt and time. Inside, the air felt like a coat put on in winter and never removed, thick, warm, and holding the scent of paper so old it seemed almost edible. Shelves climbed the walls in irregular increments, as if added in response to the arrival of each new cargo of knowledge. Stacks of bound volumes and loose folios covered the tables, leaving only narrow channels to walk. A small window at the back let in a wedge of light that barely reached the center of the room. The keeper of this place was a woman with hair the color of candle wax and eyes that moved like a scholar's hands, slow, precise, attentive to the edges. She did not ask his name. Instead, she produced a key from the folds of her skirt and led him through a side door into a chamber no larger than a chapel's side altar. Here, the shelves were deeper, the air even warmer, and the bindings more elaborate. Some spines bore titles in Latin, others in Greek, and some in languages that had no business surviving into this century. The mainstream fact was unassailable. Libraries have always been vulnerable to the tides of war, politics, and neglect. Many collections in medieval and early modern Europe were hidden, scattered, or disguised to survive. The quirky detail here was the existence of null maps, charts intentionally devoid of recognizable geography, used as catalogs for hidden archives. Each coastline or river on the map corresponded not to a place, but to a shelf or cabinet. The latitude might be the shelf height, the longitude, the number of volumes in from the left. Only the initiated could navigate them, and without the key, the map was meaningless. She handed him one such chart, its paper softened by handling, the ink browned with age. To the unknowing, it might depict some obscure island chain, but he saw at once that the harbors matched the arrangement of alcoves in the room. He traced a finger from a bay to a mountain pass, and found himself standing before a shelf of narrow volumes bound in tawny leather. Their spines bore only small stamped symbols: a rose, a compass, an eye, arranged in varying sequences. He opened one at random. Inside, the script was fine and slanted, the margins full of annotations in another hand entirely. The text itself dealt with trade agreements between distant ports, but the marginalia hinted at something more: references to unrecorded transactions, coded names for couriers, and notes on the political leanings of city councils. It was less a book than a ledger disguised as a treatise. The debated question rose naturally. Had this library been assembled merely to preserve knowledge, or was it itself an instrument of influence, its contents curated to shape decisions far beyond its walls? Some historians would later argue that such collections were neutral, accidents of chance and donor whim. Others suspected, and the vow seemed to confirm, that these archives were deliberate arsenals, their weapons made of words and records rather than steel. She replaced the book and moved to a cabinet in the corner. Its drawers were shallow, each lined with felt. From one, she lifted a folded sheet sealed with red wax. When she broke it, the faint scent of rosemary escaped, an echo of court corridors far away. The sheet contained a list, not of names, but of dates and symbols. She pointed to one in particular, a triangle over a wave. 2 weeks, she said softly, as if the air might carry the words to someone listening. They spent the rest of the hour in that chamber, the sound of pages turning like the tick of a distant clock. Every so often, she would remove a volume, consult a line or two, and replace it without comment. He realized the act itself was a signal, a part of the vow's slow language. Knowledge moved not by delivery, but by presence, by confirmation that it was still in place when needed. When at last they returned to the main room, the wedge of light from the window had shifted, now brushing the spines nearest the door. She locked the side chamber with the same deliberate care she had opened it, the key disappearing once more into her skirts. At the threshold, she handed him the null map. "Keep it," she said. "Maps are more dangerous when they don't lead where people expect." Outside, the canal lay quiet, the water a sheet of beaten pewter under the late-day sky. He rolled the map and slid it into the inner lining of his coat. It felt less like a piece of paper than a length of fuse, waiting for the right match. The thought carried him into the turning streets, where every alley seemed a margin note in a text too large to read all at once. Somewhere, far from here, another hand might be tracing the same coastline on a different map, following its fictive rivers toward an alcove holding a volume he had just seen. The vow's reach was not measured in miles, but in repetitions, in the careful replication of signs, symbols, and codes across places and generations. In that way, the library without a map was also the library without an end. As he crossed a small bridge, the water below caught a shard of sunlight and sent it flashing upward, bright enough to make him blink. In that momentary blindness, he thought of the eye carved in stone, of coins worn smooth by trust, of a fleet that could vanish without trace. When his sight returned, the city was as before, but the thought remained. Some knowledge is not hidden by distance or time, but by the simple fact that it does not wish to be found. The harbor smelled of salt and tar, of fish gutted before dawn, and spices carried across seas so long they seemed like myths. Masts jutted above the quays like a forest stripped bare, rigging humming faintly in the breeze. Here, in this tangle of docks and warehouses, the web was invisible to all but those who knew how to read its threads. Ships came and went with the regularity of tides, yet each voyage carried more than cargo. It carried intention. He stepped onto the pier where 3 ships were taking on provisions. One flew the colors of the Dutch East India Company, its hull wide-bellied for tea, porcelain, and silks. Another bore the striped pennant of a Venetian syndicate, famous for ferrying glass, dyes, and, quietly, information. The third was unmarked. its sails a plain, weather-stained cream, its crew moving with the quiet precision of men who had sailed together for years. The mainstream fact was clear to any historian. By the 17th century, maritime trade was the circulatory system of the world's economy. Companies like the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, and Venetian consortia connected continents through an intricate lattice of goods, currency, and contracts. Yet the quirky detail, rarely mentioned in public ledgers, was that certain trade alliances were never recorded at all. Instead, they existed as verbal agreements between captains, merchants, and shadow financiers, sealed by personal symbols carved into the cargo crates themselves, marks that could survive storms and inspections alike. One such crate stood on the dock beside him. Its brand looked like a simple merchant stamp, a sunburst over a wave, but he recognized the half-finished seal hidden in its center. It was an emblem that could pass as ornament to the untrained eye, yet to those bound by the vow, it meant the cargo would be trusted to safe hands anywhere along the route. He followed a dock worker into the custom shed, where a ledger as broad as a dining table lay open. The clerk dipped his pen without looking up, his entries a river of ink flowing from one column to the next. But here and there, between names of ports and weights of goods, small shapes appeared. A compass beside Amsterdam, a rose under Surat, an eye next to Venice. The marks were too inconsistent to be decoration, too deliberate to be accident. The debated question hovered over every entry. Were these marks the work of an informal merchant fraternity, or the fingerprints of something older? The vow, reborn under the sails of trade? Official history leaned toward the former, attributing them to guild codes and merchant families' private shorthand. But the alignment of symbols across distant ports suggested something more cohesive, something that could not be explained by coincidence alone. From the shed's upper window, he watched the three ships depart in sequence, each turning toward a different horizon. The unmarked vessel slid into the channel last, its wake folding the sunlight into restless ribbons. On its quarterdeck, a figure stood with hands clasped behind his back, watching the shore fade. For an instant, their eyes met across the water, and in that gaze was recognition, not of a person, but of the network both served. He left the docks and walked inland, following the route where cargo carts rattled over cobbles toward the warehouses. Inside one such building, the air was thick with the smell of pepper and damp rope. Bales and crates were stacked high, each labeled in a neat, coded script. In the dim light, it was easy to imagine the web stretching out from here, threads leading to counting houses in London, spice markets in Batavia, textile halls in Bruges, and the private rooms of Venetian bankers. The keeper of the warehouse, a tall man with a voice like low tide, spoke sparingly, but each word carried the weight of arrangement. He handed over a folded manifest, the ink still fresh. Its list of goods was ordinary: saffron, cinnamon, indigo. But the margins told another story. Tiny geometric shapes marked certain shipments, their meaning legible only to those initiated. This was not mere record-keeping. It was navigation of influence. As they spoke, the cries of gulls outside blended with the clatter of hooves and the distant strike of a ship's bell. The world moved on, oblivious to the layers beneath its commerce. Yet he could feel the hum of the vow here, as surely as he had in the printer's cellar, the banker's stall, the library's hidden chamber. The web was not in any single place. It was the space between places, the trust that allowed goods and messages to travel without a written name. When he left the warehouse, the afternoon light had shifted, casting the docks in a gold so rich it seemed minted. Ships' shadows stretched long over the water, their lines blurring into one another. He thought of the vanished fleet of La Rochelle, of the possibility that its descendants still sailed under false colors, hidden in plain sight among the world's traders. Perhaps the fleet had never truly disappeared, only woven itself into the fabric of global commerce, becoming a web that no one could untangle without tearing it apart. A cart rolled past, its crates bound with rough hemp rope. On the side of one, he caught a glimpse of the sunburst over wave mark, its edges softened by wear. The cart turned a corner, vanishing into the market's noise. The symbol lingered in his mind, a knot in the web's vast net. In the lengthening light, he felt the tug of the next thread, an older one, leading away from the quays and counting houses, back toward the quiet places where oaths were spoken and not written. The sea air clung to his coat as he walked, and with each step inland, the gulls' cries faded into the low murmur of the city, as if the web itself was pulling him toward its center. The wind had shifted by the time he reached the hilltop monastery, carrying with it the dry scent of oak leaves and the faint tang of wood smoke. The building itself sat like a stone thought pressed into the earth, neither fortress nor chapel, but some hybrid that could be either, depending on the season. Its walls bore no decoration save for a single carved lintel above the door, a ship's prow cutting through waves, its sail half rolled, as if waiting for the right wind. Inside, the corridors were cool and dim, their walls hung with plain linen instead of tapestries. The silence here was not absolute. It carried the soft scrape of quills on parchment, the muted thump of a door closing 2 rooms away, the sigh of pages being turned. He followed a monk down the hall, past alcoves where candles burned low beside stacks of books and scrolls. In the scriptorium, he was led to a desk where a single sheet of vellum lay under a weighted bar. The monk gestured and withdrew. The letter was dated 1492, a year heavy with beginnings and endings alike, and addressed to a name he did not recognize. The seal was cracked, but intact enough to read, a circle enclosing a cross, and faintly, the arc of an unfinished eye. The mainstream fact was easily confirmed. 1492 marked the year of Columbus's first voyage, the fall of Granada, and the expulsion of Jews from Spain. Political and religious upheavals shifted the map of Europe and its spheres of influence. The quirky detail of this letter was its journey. According to a faint note in the margin, it had traveled from Barcelona to Genoa, then overland to Bruges, before arriving here, its path mirroring known trade routes, yet unmarked by any official courier record. He read slowly. The first lines were polite, even formal, written in the language of trade agreements and mutual obligations. But as the letter went on, the tone softened into something more deliberate, more coded. References to safe harbors and uncharted passages could have meant maritime logistics, or the movement of people, goods, and ideas beyond the reach of kings. One phrase caught his breath: the fleet has no flag but its own shadow. In the left margin, a second hand had added brief annotations, 3 dates, 2 symbols, and the word succession. The debated question among those few who had studied this piece of vellum was whether succession referred to a transfer of wealth, of leadership within a hidden order, or of influence across a network now spanning oceans. Historians argued in articles read by almost no one. To him, the meaning seemed less an academic puzzle than a living thread. At the bottom of the letter, just above the sender's name, was a small mark pressed into the vellum. Not ink, but pressure, as if from a signet ring without wax. It formed a pattern he had seen in the merchant's manifest and the banker's coin, a design that could pass for ornament, but meant continuity to those who knew. The name itself was illegible, half smudged, the ink feathered into the fibers. Whether by accident or intent, the author had vanished into his own words. He sat for a long time with the letter, listening to the scriptorium's quiet industry. Around him, monks worked without looking up, their quills dipping and scratching in the rhythm of centuries. A window let in a square of late afternoon light that fell across the vellum, making the watermark visible, a compass with one point darkened, as if marking a direction known only to a few. When he finally rose, the monk reappeared to lead him to a small side room. There, a chest sat open on a table, filled not with gold or relics, but with other letters, each wrapped in oilskin and bound with cord. Some bore seals in unfamiliar designs, others were plain, the paper yellowed and soft. The monk gestured toward the chest, as if to say, "This is the rest of the story, but not today." Outside, the wind had freshened, rattling the dry leaves in the cloister garden. He walked the perimeter once before leaving, his boots whispering over the flagstones. The letter's phrases repeated themselves in his mind. The fleet's shadow, the uncharted passages, the notion of succession. They felt less like history than a message still in transit, one that could arrive at any moment if the conditions were right. Down the hill, the valley spread toward the horizon, dotted with villages and patches of autumn fields. Somewhere beyond those hills lay the sea, and somewhere on that sea, perhaps, sailed vessels that owed allegiance not to flag or port, but to the quiet network the letter hinted at. He imagined the parchment's journey continuing still, carried in memory, if not in hand, its cargo not of goods, but of alignment. As he reached the road, a rider passed, leading a pack horse burdened with sealed bundles. One of them bore the same rough-edged wax he had seen on documents from Venice and Amsterdam. He watched the rider disappear around the bend, the thought following him like the smell of smoke on the wind. Some letters arrive not at a destination, but at the moment when the one meant to read them is ready. The road into Bavaria unrolled, like a ribbon laid carefully across fields the color of late honey. Autumn held the air in a steady hand, neither warm nor cold, as if asking travelers to consider their pace. Towns gathered around onion-domed churches, and the Danube moved with a patience that did not advertise its strength. When Ingolstadt finally appeared, it did so in layers, ramparts first, then roofs, then the university courtyard with its echoing arcades, where footsteps sounded like punctuation in an old sentence. He carried the letter close to his ribs, stitched into the lining of his coat the way a seamstress might hide a keepsake. The seal was small and deliberate, the wax a sober red, its impression a circle with the faint suggestion of a cross that had been allowed to blur into absence. Around the ring, a halo of resin caught the light like a thin sheen of oil. The paper itself had the flexible snap of quality rag, a texture that promised to survive handling and hesitation alike. The address inside was not a name, but a place, a faculty office overlooking the courtyard, a room with books that leaned together as if conversing after the reader left. He waited until the bells had counted the hour with a measured kindness. Then, as students in brown and gray coats drifted toward their lectures, ink-stained fingers, wind-reddened cheeks, philosophy tucked under arms like bread, he crossed the courtyard. The scent here was an honest mix: beer from the tavern on the corner, damp stone, iron filings from a small workshop where locks were made for the town and for rooms where thinking liked to close the door. On a bench, a student pressed a dried leaf between 2 pages of a thick Latin volume, aligning the midrib with a margin note as if hedging a bet. If the idea failed, the leaf would keep the place warm. The office door was plain, its lock plate shaped like a slender shield. Inside, the air waited: ink, wax, a faint thread of pipe smoke that lingered not as vice, but as punctuation for long thought. A window looked out on bare branches that sketched an orderly tangle against the sky. On the desk, a goose quill lay across a sheaf of notes where clean, quick German hand had run through Latin and back without tripping. In the margin, a small doodle of an owl watched the sentence as if guarding its thesis from superstition. Fact sits most comfortably when it is set gently among textures, so it should be said plainly. On May 1st, 1776, in this university town, a law professor named Adam Weishaupt founded a society devoted to reason and reform, a brotherhood that would call itself the Illuminati. He had been educated by Jesuits before their suppression in 1773. He held a chair in canon law and then natural and moral law. He was restless with the weight of received structures and impatient for improvement that would outpace the calendar. The desk supported such facts as easily as it supported books. The wood had watched minds try to reconcile principle and practice for longer than any single man's life could teach. He set the letter down and warmed the wax with a breath, not enough to blur it, only enough to catch a scent he knew from older rooms: resin, faintly honeyed, with a memory of ash. The ringed impression felt like the mark nearest to a handshake that distance allows. When he broke it, the crack sounded exactly like frost releasing a blade of grass at dawn. The paper opened without resistance, the fold lines having learned their duty already. The words were formal at first, traveling by way of compliments to the university's good order and to the professor's steady pen. Then they thinned into another stream that ran beneath the surface, a reminder that ideas prefer channels more supple than decrees, a suggestion that human improvement thrives best when tutored privately, before it is applauded publicly. There were no names of earlier circles, no adjectives that reached too far, but a symbol sat in the left margin beside a date, a small ring, unfilled, with a dot set low like a star seen through mist. If anyone else had read it, they would have seen an invitation to correspondence about moral architecture, the shaping of character by study, and mutual correction. To a certain eye, the letter offered a relay, not a script, a seal-born assurance that networks of memory and method, refined in harder centuries, were willing to pass their habit of silence and their grammar of signals into a new curriculum, not to control the design, but to offer the mason's tools for a different building. On the sill, an acacia sprig stood in a simple glass, its green startling against the chalk-white lintel. Whether by meaning or by mere housekeeping, the sprig tilted toward the letter as if to overhear. He noticed then the quirky domesticities that stitch such hours to the body, the sand shaker with a dent in its tin top from a dropped inkwell years ago, the way the quill's nib had been trimmed just slightly off-center to suit a rightward lean, the single button placed beside a book as a bookmark because the proper marker had walked away in someone else's lecture notes. These details held the room steady, while ideas arranged themselves. He considered, as the professor would soon consider, the debated question that has stubbornly remained unsheltered by consensus. Did this society, the Illuminati that would raise Minerval owls and ladder its degrees with care, owe anything more than distant kinship to older orders and lodges? A lineage of spirit is not the same as a chain of custody. Some historians insist Weishaupt's creation grew from Enlightenment soil watered by Jesuit pedagogy and Masonic neighborliness, with no direct roots reaching to Crusader vows. Others trace a thread through methods and marks, and the habit of making an oath portable, pointing to seal rings and unwritten charters as grandparents to Minerval schedules and statutes. The paper did not adjudicate. It merely offered a door that could be opened from both sides. Outside the bells sounded again, their tones soft as bread proofing near a hearth. Students crossed the courtyard in clusters, their voices braided into a low, industrious hum, the beehive tone that craft and study share. Somewhere a blackbird rehearsed 2 notes until it made them song. He placed the letter inside a plain folder with other items that looked like nothing at all until the right hands turned them palm up. A small blank token shaped like a shield, a ribbon that held a faint scent of rosemary, a slip of paper with 3 ranks of dots and dashes that could be read as a schedule if one knew the house and the hour. When the door opened later and the chair's occupant returned, shoes dusted with chalk from a classroom floor, eyes bright with the exercise of explaining why a statute needs a conscience, the room would accept the added weight without complaint. A new society would be named not as a thunderclap, but as a candle coaxed to life, wick pinched, smoke spun into a thread, flame persuaded to stand and keep standing. Degrees would be drafted with the tidy gardener's logic of seedlings, saplings, mature trees, novice, Minerval, and beyond. Study would become ritual. Reform would become vow. The owl in the margin would stop being a doodle and take its perch as an emblem. He let his fingers rest on the folder a moment longer, feeling the grain of the desk through paper, through skin. The ring of wax on the broken letter cooled fully, leaving the faint blush that looks like nothing to the hurried eye and like continuity to the patient one. He placed a small weight on the packet, an oval stone smoothed by river water, pocket warm, to teach the paper how to stay. Evening pressed its blue thumb against the windows. The courtyard thinned of voices. Across the square, a lamplighter raised his pole and walked the edges of a text written without words, illuminating one line at a time until the page of the town could be read again. In the office, the owl's ink eye glinted without moving. The acacia sprig leaned toward darkness, but did not bow. He stepped out and closed the door with the gentleness one uses to keep a sleeping thought asleep. The stair breathed his dissent. The hall took back his footsteps and laid them alongside hundreds of others in a ledger that does not need ink. In the street, the smell of beer sharpened, and the frost began stitching a lace at the edges of puddles. Over the rooftops, a sliver moon held steady, the sort of light by which new rules are written on old habits. By the time the bells counted another hour, The room would have a second chair pulled close to the desk and a fresh candle trimmed short, so its flame would not gutter. 2 or 3 minds would begin to speak in measured, low tones, testing a vocabulary that could hold both skepticism and hope without splitting. Soon there would be schedules to keep, readings to assign, a simple badge to carry, a small owl pressed into wax, a circle of red that remembered every earlier circle while refusing to say so aloud. The night waited like an open book. Somewhere, an unseen hand set out a single sheet and a seal ring on a tin plate beside the lamp, all ordinary, all prepared. The hour when study turns into ritual was near enough to feel on the skin, like heat before flame. The Minerval nights were about to begin. The room was not grand. It kept its secrets in the scale of a study. Books shouldered close, a stove ticking softly as iron settled, 2 candles trimmed low so the flames would stand steady. Outside, frost webbed the panes, and the courtyard lay like a page left open to moonlight. Inside, the air carried 3 familiar notes: ink, beeswax, and the faint resin of red wax cooling to a ring. The letter had been read and folded. The desk had learned the weight of a new intention. They gathered as students first, and only later as anything like a circle. Coats steamed from the cold, and the smell of damp wool mingled with lamp oil as wicks were coaxed to life. The beehive hum arrived before the first words, a sound made of shifting chairs, a quill's light rasp, and the thin clink of a sand shaker being set down. Study would be the ritual, the professor's syllabus the liturgy, the hour and altar to patience. The owl on the margin of a notebook blinked in graphite, a small watchman deputized by the candlelight. History would later condense this into a sentence so neat it risked becoming lifeless. In 1776 at Ingolstadt, a society took shape with degrees named for learning, novice, minerval, and beyond, borrowing forms from the lodges while insisting that reason should be the true master of ceremony. That fact breathed warmer in the room than it does on paper. The curriculum had texture. Readings were passed on folded leaves, corners nicked by a thumbnail to mark sequence. Notes were written in a hand trained to argument but given to mercy at the edges, a teacher's pen that could carve and shelter in the same line. The first badge was not metal. It was a wafer of wax impressed on a card, an owl encircled by an unfilled ring, the red showing as a blush, more than as color in the low light. Fingers held it by its edge, the way one holds a delicate leaf, careful not to smudge. The professor's table held a small tin plate for these wafers, and a plain seal that left only the circle, never the cross. The half that was missing had been missing for a long time. Absence was still the greater part of the vow. A quirk announced itself in the domestic grammar of the night. Instead of wine, there was beer drawn quietly from a stoneware jug, the foam kept low so the room would stay sober and bright. Instead of a bell, the hour was measured by a pinched wick, its smoke curling like a sentence deciding how to end. Pseudonyms slipped into the margins of notes not as costumes, but as study aids, a mental taxonomy that kept arguments from becoming personal. Minerva's bird perched on headings and footers as if inspecting the scaffolding of thought. Reading gave way to mapping. A compass and square came out of a drawer and lay on the table with the candlesticks as equals. The square found not walls, but paragraphs, its right angle laid to a page to keep the eye honest. The compass tugged arcs across a blank leaf, sketching constellations of subjects that would touch law into natural philosophy, ethics into civil economy, history into method. On another sheet, a novice traced the roots of ideas as if they were rivers, a null map for the mind where each bay was a question and each cape a caution. The room approved by silence. The night rose to its bright ridge when study stepped across a narrow seam into vow. Not a speech, not a flourish, only a rhythm that slowed and steadied until hands and breath agreed. The words were light enough to travel and heavy enough to hold shape. Keep the work above the name, pass knowledge in forms that can change, correct the self before correcting the world. The circle did not close with a seal. It closed with a pause that felt like a key settling in a lock it had always been meant to turn. At the edges of the warmth, a debated matter kept its own counsel. How much of this was invention and how much inheritance? The lodges had spread across Europe for decades, their squares and compasses already busy turning craft into conscience. Some would say the Minerval degree was a clever graft onto that stock, a rearticulation rather than a revelation. Others would insist that a quieter river had reached this hour from older springs, carrying a grammar of oaths that had survived fire and exile. The room refused to adjudicate. It preferred work to verdicts. A ledger, perfectly ordinary to the untrained eye, kept minutes that were not minutes. In its narrow columns, the clerk's pen wrote a civic history of study, borrowed books returned, lectures kept, exercises completed. A second story ran in the spacing. In the rare grain of sand, dusted a fraction too heavily where a name needed to be remembered by certain eyes. The sand glittered and dulled. The page closed, and the light shone again on blank paper. Paper remembers most faithfully when it looks forgetful. Between pages, a pressed acacia leaf held its green. A sprig from a desk glass laid flat to become time's witness. Beside it, the coin from the past came out only briefly, a weight to keep a sheet from curling in the stove's breath. No one asked for its tail. Its two faces shone and dulled in turn like two schools of thought that could disagree without ceasing to be neighbors. The circle had no appetite for trophies. It preferred instruments. The strangest small habit of the night belonged to the ink. A drop of rosemary oil had been stirred into the pot earlier, and the scent rose faintly each time a nib went in, a promise that writing would not become mere scratching. When the quill lifted, the room smelled momentarily of the court corridors, where scented letters had once slid into sleeves. Influence had learned a new vocabulary, but memory kept its perfumes. At the far table, a novice copied a cipher, not for secrecy alone, but for discipline, a lattice that trained the mind to see pattern and patience at once. Another sketched a plan for a reading club disguised as a charity tally, a public ledger that would quietly regulate who received which pages at which hour. The city beyond the windows slept the forgiving sleep of towns that believe walls and watchmen are enough. Inside, a different guard was being trained, one that walked between thought and act. Midnight made itself known without striking. The stove's tick slowed. The candles narrowed to humbler flames. The beehive hum softened. The owl on the notebook acquired a shadow that made it look almost alive. For a moment, the room felt as still as the undercroft before a step, a poised breath that remembered Paris, and a ledger slid under stone. Study had threaded itself to continuity. The ring of wax around the night had not fully set. The acknowledged fact that anchored the hour Illuminati degrees named for learning, the Minerval badge with its small owl, the founding season in 1776, sat cleanly in the mind, like a tool washed and hung where it belongs. Around it gathered a constellation of human detail too minor for chronicles: the nicked tin shaker, the off-center nib, the way the shield-shaped lock plate took the palm like a living thing. These held the knight in the hand, made it less legend and more craft. What came next would depend on weather and will. Recruitment would follow lines already drawn by friendship, by shared benches, by shelves visited in the same order each week. Some lodges would welcome study as a fellow traveler. Others would bristle at a neighbor that preferred daylight in the mind to candle-lit ritual for its own sake. The river of reform would fork and braid, then find channels again. The owl would learn to fly from room to room without stirring curtains. A draft found the floor and walked it, lifting the corner of a paper where a schedule lay scrawled in an innocent row of dots. The door answered it with a whisper as a latecomer let himself out, boots careful on the stair, key turning with the soft authority of habit. Far off, a city watchman tapped his staff 3 times to mark an hour he would not remember in the morning. The knight carried the sound across the courtyard and set it down on the sill like a hint left under a lamp. He stamped one last wafer for the tin plate, the ring red and thin, the owl small and resolute. The circle of wax looked almost wet after the flame had been pinched, a sheen that would take its time to dull. He did not blow it colder. He let it be. Some things must dry in their own weather. When the door closed and the wicks were trimmed to stubs, the room held an afterglow like breath in winter air. On the desk, the letter's broken seal kept its faint resin shine, and the acacia leaf pressed in a book began the slow work of becoming the color of tea. In streets not far away, another kind of paper was being prepared, and other hands were warming to colder tasks. Somewhere boots learned the cadence of stairs. The ring around the knight stayed soft a moment longer, and then, almost, it set. Autumn, 1784. Edicts moved through Bavaria like cold fronts, slow in their first announcement, sudden in their arrival. Raids taught boots the cadence of monastery stairs, each step echoing a century too late for the vows beneath them. He took the west path under the yews, where paper breathes longer in stone than in air. Above the hills, the abbey held its silhouette against a sky the color of old pewter, the bell tower still silent. Frost clung to the grass, each blade tipped with a dull glint, and the river below mirrored the muted light without a ripple. If the building had a pulse, it was buried deep, behind stones that had learned centuries of patience. The mainstream fact was well recorded. In 1784 and again in 1785, the Elector of Bavaria issued decrees dismantling the Illuminati, seizing archives, dispersing lodges, and forbidding all secret societies under threat of imprisonment. The quirky detail, preserved in a clerk's private journal, described soldiers carrying away not only documents, but oddities. A brass globe split along an unfamiliar axis, sealed chests marked with circles, and books bound in leather so pale they seemed carved from bone. The debated question among historians is whether these seizures aimed only to silence political subversion, or if some officials knew they were extinguishing a much older lineage, one whose roots reached back beyond Ingolstadt's lecture halls to vaults lit by candles in a different century. He bypassed the main gate and slipped into the cloister's shadow. Ivy hid a narrow archway, its mortar line just visible to a patient eye. At its center, a carved disc held a ring around an unfilled circle. From his coat, he took a coin worn smooth by years of turning, a circle and ring that had crossed mountains and courts without ever changing. Pressed to the stone, it woke the hidden weights. A click, almost shy, rotated the disc, and a seam in the wall widened just enough to admit a man determined not to be seen. The passage beyond was narrow, its air thick with the taste of limestone. His lantern's flame wavered in the draftless dark, painting nervous shadows against walls, still marked with the chisel strokes of men long dead. 30 paces in, the first lock appeared, oak bound with blackened iron. He turned the triple ward key, teeth cut like shallow steps, and the tumblers moved with a smoothness that suggested recent care. Above, a door burst. Voices ricocheted down the cloister vaulting. Somewhere, paper hissed into flame. The second lock waited in the form of a shallow stone bowl. He set his palm into its concave chill, and the wall recognized his hand as if the cold itself had memory. A cascade of clicks answered, revealing the final seal. A depression just deep enough to take the signet ring he wore on a cord. Its face, rubbed thin, still showed the meeting of cross and eye. Pressed home, it released the chamber door at last. Inside, the space felt larger than the ground above could possibly allow. The floor was a mosaic of interlocking rings, one bearing the cross of the old order, the other an unfinished eye. Dust muted their colors, but the geometry remained sharp. Shelves cut into the walls held lead-sealed niches, bronze-bound chests, and packeted bundles wrapped in oiled cloth. The air was a mixture of wax, mineral, and something harder to name, the scent of waiting. On the central table lay ledgers in neat stacks, their spines unmarked. One bore a hand he knew instantly, the same script that had penned the 1492 letter from the hilltop monastery. Symbols recurred across bindings and seals, a compass leg to a square's right angle, a rose impressed beside a shipment list, an acacia sprig pressed between pages brittle as autumn leaves. Each was a thread in a tapestry too large for one room to display. He worked without hurry, yet without waste, moving ledgers deeper into alcoves, sliding packets into recesses where no stray ember could reach. Above, boots scraped, wood splintered, commands snapped sharp as frost. The scent of burning parchment slipped in, a dry ghost mingling with the cooler breath of the vault. In one niche, a small chest had been left unsealed. Inside lay the brass globe from the clerk's journal, its halves joined by an unfamiliar locking seam. Beside it, a quill still carried a faint rosemary scent, the same ink used in Minerval nights decades later. On a folded scrap, a tiny drawing of a beehive, perhaps a signature, perhaps a reminder, had been tucked under a weight of smooth river stone. When the panel sealed again, smoke still threaded the mortar, thin as the lines on a palm. On the table, a wafer's red wax ring refused to dry, catching the lantern's light like a stubborn ember. Upstairs, edicts burned in kindling form. Down here, memory kept a stone. He rested his palm on the inlay where cross met eye, feeling that seamless join. The vow was older than these decrees, older than this abbey's first stone. Tonight, it remained unbroken. He doused the lantern until only its heat lingered, then slipped back into the passage. Behind him, the door accepted the stone's weight, the seam vanishing into the wall's innocent face. In the cloister garden, frost had begun to soften under a hesitant dawn, A single rose hip clung to its stem, bright against the gray. He passed under the yews and did not look back. The path wound toward the outer wall, where the river's mirror still lay unbroken. Somewhere beyond the hills, towns would already be stirring, the press heating, the bells beginning their patient work. In his pocket, the coin rested beside the cooling signet. Above, a faint hum of bees, not from any hive, but from the inner ear's memory, kept time with his steps. The sky was pale and wide, promising nothing more than the next mile of road. It would be enough. The river held the new light as if it had been poured there. He followed its slow bend until the abbey's roofline flattened into ordinary hill, and the yews behind him became only commas in the morning. In his pocket, the coin rested against the cooled signet, one circle quieting another. A bell traveled across the fields with a softer voice than it had used in the night, and the frost along the path let go of its glitter and turned to water that made small stars slide into the soil. History is steady here if you let it speak without hurry. After the Bavarian decrees of 1784 and 1785, the Illuminati, in the form the records could recognize, was dismissed and scattered. Names fell from rosters. Lodges folded their benches. Boxes of papers were posted to offices and burned or boxed again and forgotten. That is the line you can draw on a chart. It is the shape a ledger prefers. Smaller weather keeps its own notes. A lamplighter in Regensburg told, years after, of a bundle left at the base of his ladder on the last night before the edict took full breath. The cloth was waxed and tied with a narrow red cord. Inside he found a quill, an unmarked ledger, and a pressed sprig of acacia that had kept its green longer than the season allowed. He used the ledger for oil orders and never spoke of the quill. The sprig he set inside the door frame so the house would remember patience. What remains unsettled is where the river of the vow went when the markers disappeared. Some say it emptied into the ground and was gone. Some say it took the underground way that water loves and came up in other springs, changed in taste, but still water. A few insist there had never been one river at all, only many small streams that ran near one another, and sometimes shared a bed when the stones allowed. He held the question without asking it to finish itself. The path lifted to a small bridge of stone, hardly an arch, but enough to make the river seem to pass from one chapter to the next. He paused and watched the current slide under his boots. A skein of geese turned above him, not in a perfect letter, but in a shape that kept adjusting to the air. On the far bank, the frost was lifting in beads, each one bright for a breath, and then gone into the grass. The day had decided to keep going. He thought of the table below the abbey, its inlay joining cross and eye with no seam to mark where one ended. He thought of the rose that had been pressed beside a shipment list long ago, and of how the petal veins outlast the flower's scent. He thought of the acacia kept between pages, because some green is meant to be seen for a while, after it has no right to be. He thought of a beehive sketched in a margin, the hum of work drawn in a single curve. A meadow opened, and the sheep, heads down, moved through it with the gravity that comes from not needing to decide anything grand. He sat on a low wall, let the coin make a slow circle in his palm, and watched it take light and then give it back. It felt like the way secrecy breathes when it is not frightened. Brightness for a moment, then shadow, then brightness again, not to hide, but to rest. The town gathered itself toward him without haste. Bread announced itself before the roofs did. In the square, a child chased a hoop and rescued it each time it fell, as if circles deserved a second chance. A printer's boy shook sand over a line and blew until the shine dulled to meaning. A locksmith leaned in his doorway with a key blank between finger and thumb and let the morning weigh it. The beehive hum was present, the kind that does its work without making a claim on the street. He bought nothing. He signed nothing. He saved his voice for thank you and walked until the houses gave way to fields again. A lamplighter tested his pole and nodded to the glass, then set the day aside until evening. Somewhere a church door opened and closed in the same breath. A sound, like a page, turned without fuss. The hour was ordinary, and that was the mercy. It seemed right to make the last stretch simple. He chose the long side of the hedgerow, where an owl was willing to watch daylight without taking it personally. He let the weight of the night go into his shoulders, and then into the ground. The vow felt lighter, but not thinner. It had simply found the size it could be held at for the distance left. Let the rose keep what red it can, and then fold to brown without complaint. Let the acacia dry to its thin consonants and wait there as a bookmark waits for a day. Let the ring of wax that refused to dry in the lamp's breath finish its work in the dark, cool, and become useful rather than beautiful. Let the beehive sleep where it sleeps until a new weather needs it to sing. Let the coin be a coin again, not an oracle. Let the signet keep its face to the cloth until another palm calls it by name. Let the compass and the square return to their drawer and teach the wood to remember lines. Let the keys rest on the nail by the door and warm themselves on a hand only when a door asks to be opened without a knock. Let ash do what ash is for, and salt do what salt is for, and water carry what it is given. Let the tide keep its appointments even on rivers that never see the sea. Let the printers lay out their forms, and the sand take the shine, and the pages fold into pockets, and then into memory, and then into kindling when their work is complete. Let the courts keep their tapestries and their scented letters and their pauses that mean more than words. Let the abbey keep its innocence of face and its very old habits under ivy. Let the field hold a shape where a man rested and then forget it by afternoon. Let the bell decide whether to speak again and at what tone. Sleep can come now in the way good sleep comes, not borrowed, not forced. The sky is willing. It has room for fact and for the braided lines that memory draws when it is trying to be careful. The hunter is there, and the plow, and the bear, and also the small private constellations that people make when they cannot help it, the triangle that looks like a sail, the little eye that tells the boat which way to look, the circle that knows it once held a cross and does not argue about it. Let the sword stay where it has stayed, quiet under the yew. Let the promise live in smaller tools where it is harder to break and easier to pass on, in cords that remember knots, in lock plates warmed by a hand, in notes that say only what the road needs to hear. Let debate remain in the corners of minds that prefer care to victory. Let certainty arrive late if it arrives at all. The ledger balances as much as it needs to for tonight. The flame will keep its counsel whether watched or not. The tide will return to places that still keep its taste, and the rumor of ships will come with it and go again. The story has learned how to fold itself small and wait on a windowsill until morning. The sky is kind. It will be kind again when you wake. The work that deserves to last knows how to breathe without you for a few hours. And that is enough, and that is mercy.